Tonight, we're exploring Azkaban lore. There is plenty to unpack tonight, but I'll keep the narration slow and steady so you can still ease into sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Long before Azkaban became the most feared prison in Wizarding Britain, its island was the private domain of a dark wizard named Ekrizdis. Somewhere in the cold North Sea, far beyond ordinary shipping routes, he built a fortress of black stone and kept its location hidden beneath powerful concealment charms. Ekrizdis was believed to have been deeply unstable, even by the standards of dark magic. The island was not originally a prison, it was a hunting ground. Muggle sailors who drifted too close to those waters were lured ashore, imprisoned within the fortress, tortured and killed. Their suffering served no known political purpose, no grand campaign, and no ambition beyond Ekrizdis's own cruel fascination with pain and fear. For years, perhaps decades, the island remained invisible to the outside world. Ships vanished. Rumors spread among sailors of strange mists and treacherous waters. Yet no one in the wizarding world knew precisely what stood there, because Ekrizdis had made certain that no visitor left with a clear memory of the place. Then Ekrizdis died. With him gone, the magic hiding the island began to fail. Ministry officials eventually discovered the fortress, along with evidence of its terrible history. But there was another discovery waiting in those narrow corridors and damp, shadowed cells. Dementors had gathered there. No one knows whether Ekrizdis created them, summoned them, or simply attracted them through the misery he caused. Dementors are not ordinary guards, beasts, or even ordinary dark creatures. They feed upon happiness. They draw warmth, hope, and every comforting memory out of the people around them, leaving behind only the darkest moments a mind has ever known. The Ministry's first reaction was not to claim the island, but to avoid it. The place was too foul, too dangerous, and too full of creatures nobody truly controlled. Azkaban was left alone for a time, its walls standing in the sea, while the Dementors multiplied within. Yet the wizarding world had a practical problem. Following the International Statute of Secrecy, small local prisons became increasingly difficult to maintain. A prisoner escaping from a modest holding cell near a wizarding village might expose the magical world to nearby muggles. The Ministry wanted one remote place, hidden from ordinary eyes, where dangerous witches and wizards could disappear. In the early 18th century, Minister for Magic Damocles Rowle decided Azkaban was the answer. His reasoning was coldly efficient. The island was isolated, the fortress already existed, and the Dementors required neither wages nor training. They would keep prisoners obedient simply by being near them. Rowle saw an inexpensive security system. What he created was a place where punishment became something much darker. Azkaban did not rely on walls alone. The sea around it was difficult to cross, but it was despair that truly held the prisoners. Day after day, Dementors moved past the cells, and the inmates began to lose access to the memories that made life bearable. A childhood summer, the face of a loved one, a moment of pride, a joke once shared with a friend, all of it faded beneath the constant pressure of fear. What remained were the worst memories. Prisoners remembered grief with perfect clarity. Shame, loss, every regret they had tried to bury. Many stopped eating. Many stopped speaking. Some became violent or incoherent, while others simply withdrew into themselves until there seemed to be nothing left worth saving. For the Ministry, Azkaban's cruelest feature also appeared to be its greatest success. Almost nobody escaped. Minister Eldritch Diggory visited the prison years later and was horrified by what he found. He saw prisoners who had been broken rather than reformed, minds hollowed out by creatures the Ministry had chosen to employ. There were protests and objections, but the prison remained open. Its apparent security mattered more than the humanity of the people inside. and so Azkaban endured, rising from an island built for private cruelty into an institution of official cruelty, its name becoming a quiet threat in wizarding homes across Britain. Out on the black North Sea horizon, where the water meets the sky in a permanent grey, there exists an island that no map can find. It appears only when its magic permits it, and for most of the wizarding world, it is known only through whispered tales of dread. This is Azkaban, Britain's most feared wizarding prison, hidden from muggles and most wizards alike. But the true terror of Azkaban does not lie in its walls of black stone or the icy waters that surround it. The prison's walls are not its true defense. The guards are the ones that feed on hope itself. Before it became a prison, this island was the private domain of a dark wizard named Ekrizdis. In the 15th century, he built a fortress here, a place of black stone and deep shadows, concealed by powerful magic. Ekrizdis was believed to be deeply unstable, even by the standards of dark magic. He used the island as a hunting ground. Muggle sailors who drifted too close to these waters were lured ashore, trapped within the fortress, and subjected to unspeakable torments. Their suffering served no political purpose, no grand campaign, only Ekrizdis's own cruel fascination with pain and fear. For years, the island remained invisible to the outside world. Ships vanished, rumors spread, but no one in the wizarding world knew precisely what stood there, because Ekrizdis made certain no visitor left with a clear memory. Then, Ekrizdis died. With him gone, the magic hiding the island began to fail. Ministry officials eventually discovered the fortress, along with evidence of its terrible history. But there was another discovery waiting in those narrow corridors and damp, shadowed cells. Dementors had gathered there. No one knows whether Ekrizdis created them, summoned them, or simply attracted them through the misery he caused. Dementors are not ordinary guards, beasts, or even ordinary dark creatures. They feed upon happiness. They draw warmth, hope, and every comforting memory out of the people around them, leaving behind only the darkest moments a mind has ever known. The Ministry's first reaction was not to claim the island, but to avoid it. The place was too foul, too dangerous, and too full of creatures nobody truly controlled. Azkaban was left alone for a time, its walls standing in the sea, while the Dementors multiplied within. Yet the wizarding world had a practical problem. Following the International Statute of Secrecy, small local prisons became increasingly difficult to maintain. A prisoner escaping from a modest holding cell near a wizarding village might expose the magical world to nearby muggles. The Ministry wanted one remote place, hidden from ordinary eyes, where dangerous witches and wizards could disappear. In the early 18th century, Minister for Magic Damocles Rowle decided Azkaban was the answer. His reasoning was coldly efficient. The island was isolated, the fortress already existed, and the Dementors required neither wages nor training. They would keep prisoners obedient simply by being near them. Rowle saw an inexpensive security system. What he created was a place where punishment became something much darker. Azkaban did not rely on walls alone. The sea around it was difficult to cross, but it was despair that truly held the prisoners. Day after day, Dementors moved past the cells, and the inmates began to lose access to the memories that made life bearable. A childhood summer, the face of a loved one, a moment of pride, a joke once shared with a friend. All of it faded beneath the constant pressure of fear. What remained were the worst memories. Prisoners remembered grief with perfect clarity, shame, loss, every regret they had tried to bury. Many stopped eating, many stopped speaking, some became violent or incoherent, while others simply withdrew into themselves until there seemed nothing left worth saving. For the Ministry, Azkaban's cruelest feature also appeared to be its greatest success. Almost nobody escaped. Minister Eldritch Diggory visited the prison years later and was horrified by what he found. He saw prisoners who had been broken rather than reformed, mines hollowed out by creatures the Ministry had chosen to employ. There were protests and objections, but the prison remained open. Its apparent security mattered more than the humanity of the people inside, and so Azkaban endured, rising from an island built for private cruelty into an institution of official cruelty, its name becoming a quiet threat in wizarding homes across Britain. The name itself carries echoes of Alcatraz and Abaddon, a word meaning place of destruction or depths of hell, a fitting title for a place where hope went to die. But even Azkaban had its weaknesses. In the years following the first defeat of Voldemort, there were mass breakouts. Sirius Black became the first person to escape without outside help, proving that even the Dementors could be overcome by a determined mind. Later, Barty Crouch Jr. escaped with the help of his mother, and during the Second Wizarding War, the Death Eaters took over the prison, releasing their comrades and imprisoning innocent Muggle-borns. After the war, Kingsley Shacklebolt became Minister for Magic and purged Azkaban of all Dementors. They were replaced by Auras, rotated regularly from the mainland to prevent the psychological toll that once consumed so many. Under this new system, there has been no breakout, and conditions have improved. The prison still stands, but its dark legacy remains. As the island continues to rise from the North Sea, its story is a reminder of what can happen when fear and efficiency replace compassion. The magic that once hid it is gone, but the shadow of its history will never fully fade. The previous chapter mapped the edges of this story, introducing the island as a blank spot on every map, a scar in the North Sea that the magical world tried very hard to ignore for centuries. But it was not always an official institution. It began life as something much darker, much more personal. To understand the prison Azkaban became, we have to look at what it was built to be. We have to travel back to the 15th century. The wizarding world was a different place then. Dark wizards were not hunted with the same relentless determination they would be in later centuries. There were wilder regions, places where a man with enough power and enough ambition could carve out his own territory. This is exactly what Ekrizdis did. His name is barely a footnote in magical history, and that is likely exactly how he would have wanted it. He did not seek fame in the traditional sense. He did not gather followers or build an army. He sought solitude, absolute solitude, so that he could practice his art without interruption. And what was his art? Pain, the measurement of suffering, the deliberate creation of profound, soul-destroying despair. He found this island, a dark fortress of rock rising from the churning North Sea, battered by storms so fierce that even the toughest Muggle vessels gave it a wide berth, and if they did not avoid it, they could not find it. Ekrizdis had layered the island in concealment charms of incredible potency. He had created a blind spot in the world, a place where reality itself had been told to look the other way. Here, there were no witnesses, no law, no rescue. It was the perfect canvas for a wizard who wanted to operate completely beyond the reach of the ordinary. He constructed a fortress, not by hauling stone from the mainland, but by carving it directly from the island. He shaped the rock itself, raising walls so thick they could muffle the most desperate cries from within. He built dormitories and dungeons, chambers for experimentation, and chambers for storage. It was a lair, a laboratory, a private cathedral to the darkest of the dark arts. But even the most reclusive wizard requires subjects for his work, and so Ekrizdis set his sights on the Muggle sailors who dared to pass through his waters, the men who navigated the North Sea in search of trade or passage. He lured them. The records do not say exactly how, but the methods of a dark wizard are rarely subtle. Perhaps he conjured the image of a safe harbor during a violent storm, a warm light flickering against the freezing rain. Perhaps he used a siren's call, a magical frequency that bypassed reason and pulled at something primal in the sailors' minds, forcing them to turn the wheel toward the island. Whatever the method, they came. They sailed directly into his trap, their ships dragged against the sharp rocks by the unforgiving current. They never returned. They vanished from the world, swallowed whole by the island. Family and friends never saw them again. Their names faded from records. They simply ceased to be. Inside the fortress, Ekrizdis subjected them to horrors that went far beyond physical pain. He was fascinated by the architecture of fear. He wanted to understand the exact dimensions of human despair. How much terror could a mind contain before it fractured? Where was the precise boundary between hope and surrender? He tested these limits relentlessly, over and over again. This was the true origin of Azkaban. It did not begin as a prison for the wicked. It did not begin as a place of justice or deterrence. It began as a private house of torture, a secluded workshop where one man indulged his darkest obsessions without limit or consequence. The future of the prison was written in the agony of those first lost sailors, whose suffering soaked into the very stone. Eventually, Ekrizdis grew old. He died within his own fortress. And with his passing, the concealment spells he had so carefully woven began to fray and fall apart. The great blind spot in the North Sea faded, and the Ministry of Magic became aware of a structure that should not have been there. Aurors were dispatched to investigate. They landed on the shore and immediately felt a cold that had nothing to do with the northern wind. It was a spiritual cold, a weight that pressed down on the soul. The grass was withered, no birds flew overhead. The air was unnaturally still. They entered the fortress and found it empty of its master. But it was far from empty. The corridors were alive with a presence they could not immediately name. And then they saw them, the Dementors. Dozens upon dozens of them, gliding through the chambers, feeding on the thick, cloying misery that still saturated every inch of the stone. No one knows precisely how the Dementors came to be on that island. Some historians believe that Ekrizdis created them, that his experiments with suffering went so far into the darkness that he actually tore a piece of the human soul from its moorings and left it drifting, endlessly hungry. Others believe that the Dementors are not created, but drawn, that they are naturally attracted to extreme decay and profound unhappiness, and that 2 centuries of torture acted like a beacon, summoning them across the sea to feast on the residual pain. Whatever the truth, the Ministry was horrified. The Aurors who entered that fortress reported an overwhelming sense of despair that lingered for weeks. They sealed the fortress tight and left. The idea of using this place for any official purpose was unthinkable. It was too terrible. The island was left to the Dementors, a dark legend, abandoned to the mist and the waves. For generations, that is where it stayed. The wizarding world moved on. The International Statute of Secrecy was enacted, forcing magic deeper underground. Small local prisons, the dungeons of wizarding governments across Britain, became liabilities. Too easy to escape from, too difficult to hide from Muggle eyes. The Ministry needed a new solution, a single, dedicated place of confinement, somewhere secure enough to hold the worst criminals in the world. And so, gradually, the gaze of the Ministry turned back toward the North Sea, back toward the island no map could find. The fortress of Ekrizdis was still there. The Dementors were still there. From a purely practical standpoint, it was already perfectly suited for its dark purpose. It would take a very particular minister to make the decision to unlock those gates. A minister willing to accept the terrible cost that came with such a place. A minister brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to make a pact with the very embodiment of despair. But to truly understand Azkaban, we must first understand the mind that shaped it, the mind of Ekrizdis. He did not build a prison, he built a temple to suffering. A fortress far from witnesses, far from rescue, far from any law that might have stopped him. And within those walls, he indulged his madness completely. Ekrizdis is a name that sits awkwardly in the history books. He is not celebrated like the great conquerors. He is not remembered for a grand philosophy or a dark crusade. He is remembered for his cruelty and for nothing else. That is the entirety of his legacy. Not power, not ambition, just the unyielding, grinding horror of what he did to other human beings. He was a practitioner of the darkest arts, arts so dark that their very principles have been outlawed for centuries. And his laboratory was an island in the North Sea. He did not seek to rule the world. He sought to understand suffering. He wanted to map the limits of human endurance. He wanted to see if magic could create something from pure misery. The island became saturated with that misery. The stones drank it in. The air grew thick with it. It was a place where happiness simply could not exist, where every corner held the memory of agony. It is said that Ekrizdis did not merely attract the Dementors to his island. Some believe he invented them, that the creatures that feast on human joy were born from his endless rituals within these walls. Whether that is true or not, the connection between his work and their existence is impossible to ignore. His victims were taken from passing ships, Muggle sailors, lost in the fog. He would bring them to his fortress, not to question them, not to use them for political gain. He tortured them for his own amusement. It was the pleasure of cruelty, pursued for its own sake. He was fascinated by the slow dismantling of a human mind. One of the recovered journals describes his intense interest in the precise moment a victim lost all hope. He saw this as the culmination of his work, not a death, but a final surrender of the soul. The fortress itself became a monument to this obsession. It was not designed as a prison, it was designed as a crucible. The spiral layout forces sound inward, or perhaps it was meant to trap it, creating an endless echo of terror. The walls are unnaturally thick. The corridors twist back on themselves. It was a maze designed to break the spirit of anyone who entered, even those who came willingly. And within this fortress, Ekrizdis conducted his experiments. He wanted to create despair, and in a way, he succeeded beyond his wildest imagination. The suffering he generated did not vanish when he died. It lingered, it festered, it attracted something. When his life finally ended, and the concealment charms he had placed upon the island faded for the first time in decades, the Ministry of Magic finally became aware of its existence. A team of aurors and investigators was sent to the site. What they found inside the fortress is not widely recorded. The official records were sealed, and remain sealed to this day, but the rumors that escaped are enough to turn the stomach. They found signs of rituals so dark they defied description. They found layers of human suffering so deeply ingrained in the stone that the castle itself seemed to breathe despair. And they found the Dementors. Drawn by the feast of agony that Ekrizdis had cultivated, they had made the island their home. The Ministry, horrified, walled up the deepest chambers. They tried to cleanse the island, but the darkness was too old, too deep. It could not be removed. It could only be locked away, and it waited there, patient as stone, for the day when the Ministry's need for a place to hold its worst criminals would overcome its horror at the place itself. And when that day came, the decision was presented as practical. Azkaban was isolated. Escape was nearly impossible. The Dementors were already there, and they could be controlled, or so the Ministry believed. Why construct a new prison when this terrible place could be made useful? It was the kind of reasoning that turns a warning into a weapon. The Ministry did not destroy Ekrizdis' fortress. It claimed it. The cells were reinforced. The gates were sealed. The island's horror was given uniforms, regulations, and an official purpose. But the ancient darkness beneath it remained untouched. Azkaban became a prison, yet it never stopped being what Ekrizdis had made it. A machine built to strip hope from the people trapped inside. And that is perhaps the darkest part of its history. The prison was not born from justice. It was born from cruelty, then adopted by a government that convinced itself cruelty could be useful. A fortress built for suffering cannot exist in a place where it can be easily seen, or heard, or discovered. Ekrizdis understood this intimately. The isolation of the North Sea was not enough. The rocky cliffs and the constant storms were not sufficient safeguards against the curious or the unlucky. And so, after he had finished shaping the stone of his fortress to his will, he turned his attention to the magic that would wrap around the island like an invisible shroud. He cast concealment charms of such depth and specificity that the island did not simply become hard to find. It ceased to exist in the minds of those who approached it. Ekrizdis layered the island with enchantments that went far beyond the standard muggle-repelling wards most wizards use to protect their homes. These were spells born of the very same obsessive study of the dark arts that filled his dungeons with suffering. They did not just make the fortress invisible to the eye, they made it unthinkable to the mind. A sailor looking out across the grey waters of the North Sea, directly at the spot where the island sat, would see only an empty horizon. Their gaze would slide past the fortress, as if it were a fog bank they had already forgotten. Their mind simply refused to register the contradiction of stone and iron where no landmass should exist. Fishing vessels and merchant ships passed within a few miles of the island's jagged coast without ever knowing it was there. The sounds that must have drifted across the water on quiet nights, the clanking of chains and the muffled roars of the men and women being unmade by magic inside the stone walls, these sounds were swallowed by the same enchantments. The North Sea is a harsh and treacherous place even under calm skies. Storms appear without warning. Currents drag ships off course. The fog reduces visibility to nothing. Any captain or sailor who heard a strange cry in the night would dismiss it without a second thought, chalking it up to the wind, or a seabird, or the natural paranoia that life at sea breeds. Any glimpse of a dark through the mist would be blamed on poor weather or an exhausted mind, and by the time the ship had sailed on, the memory of the strange shape or the unsettling sound had already dissolved, leaving no mark in the logbooks and no question in the minds of the crew. Year after year, decade after decade, the sea kept Ekrizdis' secrets better than any human accomplice could have managed. The tides rose and fell around the island's base without revealing its shape. The fog rolled in and out, layering the fortress in a perpetual grey twilight that was as much magical as it was natural. The cold waters of the North Sea hid the island from the world, and the enchantments on the island hid the world from the prisoners within. No rescue ships ever arrived. No investigations were launched. As far as the Ministry of Magic was concerned, the island did not exist. As far as the Muggles were concerned, the men and women who vanished from the coastal towns and the merchant vessels had simply met the fate of the sea, drowned, lost, forgotten. And in a way, that was exactly what had happened. For all magic, no matter how powerful, is bound to the one who casts it. Ekrizdis had poured his entire being into the stone of the fortress and the spells that surrounded it. But he was still a mortal man. His cruelty had no end, but his life did. The enchantments he had woven into the island were rooted in his own power, his own will. No one else knew how to sustain them. No one else had the inclination or the knowledge to maintain the deep, suffocating concealment he had created. And so, when Ekrizdis finally died, and history is mercifully quiet on the exact details of how he met his end, the island itself seeming to have swallowed the secret of his death, the magic he had built began to fray at the edges. The first sign was the fog. It began to behave strangely, pooling in places where it should not, thinning in places where it was always thickest. Then the sound started to carry across the water, where before there had been only silence. A passing ministry vessel, or perhaps a wizard travelling the sea lanes, reported hearing something from a patch of ocean that the charts insisted was empty. The report was filed, noted, and almost dismissed. But someone in the Auror office sensed that this was not a trick of the wind. Someone looked directly at the island at exactly the right moment, when the fragmented enchantment allowed the truth through for just a few seconds. The spell collapsed entirely, and the island appeared on the horizon as if it had been there all along, which, of course, it had. The Ministry of Magic sent a team to investigate what had been hidden for so long. They did not find a fortress prepared for occupation. They did not find a prison ready to receive inmates. They found a wound in the world, left open and festering for decades. The Dementors that had bred in the darkness Ekrizdis created were still there, feeding on the residue of centuries of concentrated suffering, growing thicker and more powerful in the absence of any opposing force. The concealment had not only hidden the island from the world, it had hidden the world from the island, and now that the spell was broken, the full horror of what Ekrizdis had done was finally exposed to the light. The ministry sealed the entrance and left the island to the elements, believing that a place so steeped in that kind of darkness was beyond redemption or use. They cordoned it off from the rest of the magical world and tried to forget it. But a place like that does not simply fade back into the sea, it waits. And in the centuries that followed, as the wizarding world grew and changed, a new minister for magic would look at that abandoned fortress and see not a charnel house to be forgotten, but a solution to an impossible problem. He would see a prison. The concealment woven by Ekrizdis outlasted him. It was a powerful spell, anchored to the island itself, but it was a spell without a master. Spells without masters are like clocks without winding. They tick slower and slower until they stop. Once Ekrizdis died, the magic that held the island in a blind spot began to fray. It did not shatter overnight. It took years, perhaps decades. The island did not appear suddenly. It emerged slowly, a shape forming in the mist where no shape should have been. The barriers between its existence and the perception of the outside world grew thin. Ships began to report strange currents near a point in the North Sea where no land was charted. A fisherman might have glimpsed dark stone through a break in the clouds, only to have it vanish again. The secret was dying, and the island was returning to the world. It was the Ministry of Magic that finally took notice. A routine patrol of Aurors, or perhaps a concerned report from a magical community on the coast, triggered an investigation. What they found when they breached the final veil of concealment was a sight none of them ever forgot. The fortress of Ekrizdis sat on the island like a crown of thorns. Black stone, high walls, windows that looked like empty eye sockets. It was abandoned. Its master had vanished, but he had left his work behind. The ministry officials walked through halls that felt thick with residual pain, as if the very air was saturated with old screams. They found rooms that could only be described as torture chambers, instruments of dark magic, rusted but still humming with faint energy, and they found the victims, or what remained of them, Muggle sailors lured from their ships, their belongings scattered in the stone corridors. The ministry had stumbled onto a crime scene that spanned decades. It was a monument to cruelty, built in silence, hidden from justice for a century. But the worst was not the evidence of the past. The worst was what had taken root in the ruins. The Dementors were already there. It is impossible to know if Ekrizdis summoned the first of them, or if they were drawn to the island by the sheer volume of suffering he generated. Perhaps he created them through his experiments in the dark arts. Scholars have never agreed, but regardless of their origin, the Dementors had nested in the fortress. They filled the lower levels. They drifted through the hallways. The ministry team felt them before they saw them. A profound cold, a weight of despair that settled on the shoulders. Happy memories became distant, hard to grasp. The Dementors did not attack the officials. They did not need to. They simply watched, or rather, they sensed them, feeding on the warmth of the living. The team did not stay long. No one who set foot on that island stayed longer than they had to. The report that reached the Department of Magical Law Enforcement was stark. The island was a weapon, not one that could be fired, but one that radiated poison. The presence of the Dementors changed everything. They could not simply destroy the fortress and leave. The Dementors would spread. They would drift toward the coasts of Britain and Europe, infecting everything they touched. The dark magic was too tightly woven into the stones. Fire might not cleanse it. It might merely release it. The ministry faced a problem with no clean solution. Destroy the island's evil or contain it. There was no middle ground. The fortress was a well of darkness, and the Dementors were the water that filled it. Drain the well and risk flooding the world. Cap the well and hope it held. In the end, the Ministry chose containment. It was the safer option, at least in the short term. The fortress was sealed so deeply that even the Dementors could not leave. The concealment charms were recast, stronger than ever. The island of Azkaban was stricken from the official maps of the wizarding world. A blanket of oblivion was thrown over it. For a long time it worked. The island sat in the North Sea, forgotten by most, a sealed tomb for a nightmare. But the Dementors grew. They bred in the darkness and the cold. They became stronger. And the Ministry, as it wrestled with the impossible task of housing its own growing criminal population after the enforcement of the International Statute of Secrecy, found itself looking for new solutions. The old prisons were failing. Escapes were becoming common. And every time a Minister for Magic looked at the map of Britain and saw that blank spot in the North Sea, they remembered the solution they had tried to bury. It was a terrible solution. It was an inhuman solution, but it was a solution that would hold anyone, forever, with no need for guards, no need for walls, because the walls themselves were made of despair. The Ministry officials who stepped into the fortress after Ekrizdis' death expected to find the remnants of terrible experiments, perhaps the bones of Muggle sailors scattered across the stone floors, perhaps dark artifacts left to decay in the damp air. What they found instead was a cold so deep it seemed to have a will of its own. They moved through the corridors, and the torches sputtered. Light refused to penetrate the shadows naturally. The air grew thick, heavy, and still, and then they felt it. A presence. Something that existed in the spaces between breaths, in the corners of vision that refused to focus. It was not a creature of flesh and blood. It was wretchedness given form. It drifted into the corridor, tattered cloaks brushing the floor, hands, like dead things, reaching out from beneath the fabric. And where its face should have been, there was nothing. Just a dark void. A hole in the world where a soul should have lived. The Dementors. They had not been created by Ekrizdis, at least not directly. They had been drawn here. The experimental cruelty of that dark wizard had soaked into the very stones of this island. The pain and terror of his victims lingered like a stain in the magic of the place, and the Dementors had come to feed. This is the first law of a Dementor. They are drawn to misery, fear, and despair. They are instinctual beings, driven by an endless hunger for happiness. They do not see in the way we understand sight, but they sense the emotional topography of a place. They are drawn to suffering, like water flowing downhill. And on this island, suffering had been cultivated for decades. The walls themselves remembered the screams. Their very presence alters the world around them. The air grows cold. Not the cold of winter, or the cold of stone, but a cold that seems to sap the very warmth from inside you. The light dims. Colours seem to leach away into grey, and the mind begins to fail. The first thing that goes is happiness. You try to remember a joyful moment, the face of a loved one, a beautiful sunset, but the memory feels hollow. It is still there, but the feeling attached to it is gone, drained away. In its place, the worst memories begin to surface. Every failure, every loss, every moment of shame or terror. These memories are not just recalled, they are relived, fully, as if they are happening again in that exact moment. The Dementor makes you live your lowest moments on a loop, while your brightest moments slip just out of reach. This is the true weapon of the Dementor. It does not need to harm you physically. It starves you of everything that makes you yourself. It leaves you hollowed out, a husk filled only with echoes of pain. The Ministry wizards felt this, even in their brief encounter. They knew they could not stay long. To remain in the presence of a Dementor for too long was to risk permanent damage, a slow erosion of the self. They understood the legends, the rare texts that spoke of such entities, beings that had no soul of their own, and thus craved the richness of the souls they could drain. The Dementor's kiss, the ultimate violation, was a fate worse than death. To have your soul sucked out through your mouth, leaving behind an empty shell of a body, a mind completely blank. But even without the kiss, prolonged exposure was a sentence worse than execution. The Ministry realized that removing these creatures from the island might be entirely impossible. They had infested the deepest cells, the highest towers, the corridors that wound through the heart of the fortress. To try to drive them out would require an army of the most powerful wizards alive, capable of casting Patronus charms for hours on end. It was a war they were not prepared to fight. Against an enemy that could not be killed, they could leave Azkaban to rot, seal the island away again, declare it a cursed place, and let the Dementors starve in the absence of human emotion. But the Dementors had already fed deeply on the misery left by Ekrizdis. They were strong, and the Ministry was facing a practical problem. They needed a prison. The Dementors offered a solution, a terrible solution, an inhuman one, but a solution nonetheless. If the Dementors could not be removed, perhaps they could be employed. The cold that had settled into the stone of the corridors was not going to leave. The Ministry made a choice that day, not to fight the darkness, but to use it, to contain prisoners within an environment designed to strip them of their will, their hope, their very minds. And so the creatures in the corridors became the guardians of the prison. The Dementors were given what they wanted, an endless supply of misery, and the Ministry got what they wanted, a prison with no escape, because no one who entered ever had the strength left to leave. It was a pact with despair itself. The discovery of the Dementors was not just a zoological surprise. It was a moral shockwave that struck the very heart of the Ministry. These were not merely dark creatures drawn to the island after the fact. They were a corruption given form, a direct residue of the experiments Ekrizdis had conducted. They fed on the atmosphere he had created. When the first surveyors returned from the fortress, they did not speak of usable walls or defensible battlements. They spoke of the silence in the corridors, a silence so complete it felt like a weight pressing down on the mind. They spoke of the cold, not the cold of the northern wind, but a cold that came from the stone itself, a cold that made happiness feel like a foreign language. The men and women who led the Wizengamot in those early years looked at Azkaban and did not see a solution. They saw a contamination. The legacy of Ekrizdis had saturated every stone with a profound depth of cruelty that had quite literally attracted the worst form of life. To use this place for any official purpose, let alone to house prisoners, felt like a complete moral surrender. It felt like an admission that the Ministry was willing to govern through pure terror. And so the first official verdict on the island was a firm rejection. It was declared too horrifying to use. The gates were sealed, the concealment charms were left in place, and the Ministry walked away. They left the fortress to the wind, the salt spray, and the Dementors. They hoped that time and isolation might erode the curse that lay upon the stone. Without a central prison, the British magical community had to adapt. Justice was handled through a patchwork of smaller local prisons. Wizards convicted of serious crimes were held in Ministry dungeons, in remote magical towers, or in holding cells attached to local courts. There were old jails hidden in the Orkney Islands, vaults beneath ancient wizarding towns, and secure rooms in the homes of trustworthy Aurors. It was a system built on personal responsibility and a small community. If someone escaped, they could usually be tracked down by the local authorities. Before the incident forced the Ministry to intervene, for a time this system worked. The scale of the world was small enough, but the political landscape of the magical world was shifting beneath their feet. When the International Statute of Secrecy was fully enacted in the late 17th century, the entire structure of justice had to be rethought. The fundamental principle of magic was now secrecy. A single witch or wizard escaping from a crumbling local jail and running through a muggle village was no longer an inconvenience to be quietly resolved by obliviators. It was a direct threat to the survival of the statute itself. Every escape had the potential to become a global crisis. The small prisons that had once seemed reasonable had become liabilities. The Ministry could no longer afford the luxury of moral revulsion. The community needed a prison that was truly secure. It needed somewhere completely isolated, somewhere no muggle would ever stumble upon, somewhere no witch or wizard could ever hope to leave. And as the pressure of the new century mounted, the shape of Azkaban never truly left the Ministry's horizon. The fortress sat there, rejected but not forgotten, a monument to the worst of wizard kind, waiting for a leader who was willing to look past the human cost and see only the guarantee of absolute control. That leader was Damocles Rowle. As Minister for Magic, Rowle inherited a system strained by fear, secrecy, and the growing demand for a punishment no criminal could evade. He did not deny what Azkaban was. He simply decided that its horrors could be made useful. Under his authority, the island was claimed by the Ministry and transformed from a hidden ruin into Britain's central wizarding prison. The decision was presented as necessity. The sea would prevent escape, the concealment charms would protect the statute, and the Dementors, terrifying as they were, would serve as guards who could not be bribed, distracted, or overcome by ordinary means. But there was a darker truth beneath that argument. The Ministry had not conquered Ekrizdis' legacy, it had incorporated it. The same despair that had made the fortress unfit for civilized use became the very foundation of its security. From that moment onward, a sentence to Azkaban meant far more than confinement. It meant being delivered into a place where hope itself was treated as something to be drained away. The previous chapter left us standing at a dead end. The Ministry had discovered a fortress too horrifying to use, a place soaked in the worst of the dark arts, infested by creatures that drained all warmth and hope from the air. For a time, this was the end of the story. Azkaban was sealed, abandoned. It seemed the only civilized choice. But history rarely respects sensible choices. The International Statute of Secrecy changed how wizarding Britain had to police itself. The old model, with its small local prisons scattered across the country, became a liability. An escaped criminal from a village lockup could wander into a muggle town and expose magic before anyone could stop him. The risk was not simply that a prisoner went free, but that the entire hidden world might be revealed. The statute depended entirely on absolute containment. The Ministry began a desperate search for one single, secure, isolated national prison, a place where escape was not just unlikely, but physically impossible. As officials surveyed their options, their gaze drifted, reluctantly, back toward the North Sea, back toward that black dot on the chart that they had all tried to forget. In the cold logic of administration, something shifted. Azkaban's curse suddenly began to look like an advantage. The Dementors asked for nothing. They did not sleep, they did not accept bribes, and they never allowed a prisoner to leave. The horror the Ministry had recoiled from was quietly reclassified as a resource. The isolation that made the island a perfect lair for a madman made it a perfect solution for a government carrying the full weight of secrecy. The question was no longer whether Azkaban should be used, but whether the Ministry could tolerate the cost of using it. And in the year 1718, a new Minister for Magic took office. The seal on that question was broken. The conversation shifted from a moral dilemma to a practical problem. The fortress was opened, and the Dementors were given a feast. Minister Damocles Rowle did not invent the cruelty of Azkaban. What he did was make it official. Under his administration, the island ceased to be an embarrassment hidden in Ministry records and became the centerpiece of British magical law enforcement. Prisoners were gathered from across the country and transported by sea to the fortress. There the Dementors took over the work no human jailer wanted to do. It was an arrangement built on terror, but also on convenience. The Ministry did not need to train a large guard force. It did not need to worry about keys, walls, patrols, or the ordinary weaknesses of human beings. The Dementors required only access to prisoners. In return, they created a prison from which almost nobody could escape. Almost nobody. For the people sent there, Azkaban was not merely a sentence of confinement. It was a sentence of slow destruction. Dementors did not simply stand watch outside cell doors. They filled the corridors. They glided past the prisoners day and night, drawing out every happy memory they could find. A person might enter Azkaban remembering a birthday, a friendship, the warmth of a fire, or the sound of someone laughing. After enough time, those memories became distant, then fragile and impossible to hold on to. What remained was fear. The prisoners heard the screams of others through the walls. They felt the cold seep into their bones. They relived their worst moments, until those moments seemed to be the only things they had ever known. Many lost the ability to speak. Some forgot why they had been imprisoned. Some forgot their own names, and some simply stopped wanting to live. The Ministry understood all of this. It was not a hidden side effect discovered generations later. The Dementors had been known from the beginning. Their nature was obvious. Yet Azkaban endured because it worked exactly as intended. The prison frightened criminals, silenced critics, and gave the public a brutal reassurance that dangerous witches and wizards could be removed from society forever. There was another reason the arrangement lasted. After the island became a prison, the Dementors were no longer an isolated horror beyond the edge of the map. They became dependent on the Ministry. The government supplied them with victims, and the Dementors supplied the government with security. It was a partnership no decent person would have chosen freely. But once it existed, ending it became increasingly difficult. Every new prisoner made Azkaban more useful. Every successful containment made it easier to ignore the suffering inside. And every year that passed transformed a shameful emergency measure into tradition. By the time later generations spoke of Azkaban, few remembered that it had once been abandoned in disgust. They knew it only as the wizarding world's most feared prison, a place so terrible that its name alone could make grown witches and wizards fall silent. But beneath the Ministry's official language of justice and public safety, the truth remained unchanged. Azkaban had never been made safe. It had merely been pointed at the people the Ministry wanted to disappear. The International Statute of Secrecy forced Wizarding Britain to confront a problem it had long avoided. The old model of holding prisoners in local cellars or isolated towers was becoming untenable. Every escape was a risk to the fragile peace between the magical and non-magical worlds. The Ministry needed a single solution, a place where criminals could be sent and forgotten, a fortress so secure that no whisper of magic could ever reach a Muggle ear. This was the problem facing Damocles' Rowle when he became Minister for Magic in the year 1718. He was a man who believed in order, in decisive action, and in a solution that required no second thoughts. The debate over what to do with the island of Azkaban had dragged on for decades. Earlier ministers had looked at the fortress and seen only the residue of a madman's cruelty. They had seen the Dementors and recoiled. Rowle saw something else entirely. He saw the answer. He made the decisive choice that would define his entire administration. He insisted that Azkaban become Britain's central wizarding prison. The island was already there. The fortress was already standing. The concealment charms were already in place. It was in his eyes the only logical option. There would be no new construction, no stretching of the Ministry's budget for a purpose-built jail. The solution was already waiting in the North Sea, dark and ready. To make this work, Rowle had to confront what lived inside those walls. The Dementors had been the primary reason the Ministry hesitated for so long. They were a horror, a contamination left behind by Ekrizdis that made the island unthinkable for any decent purpose. Rowle looked at them and did not see a problem to be solved. He saw a resource to be exploited. He reclassified the Dementors. They were no longer an unspeakable terror to be quarantined. They became a cost-saving security force. They asked for no wages. They required no rest. They did not answer to any commanding officer. They simply existed, drawn to misery, and the Ministry could direct that nature toward its own ends. And so, a place built for murder was transformed into a state institution. The private lair of a madman became the cornerstone of magical law enforcement. The suffering that had once been confined to a single wizard's dark pleasure was now systematized, legalized, and institutionalized. The Ministry did not simply open the gates. They sealed a pact with the very creatures that fed on human happiness. The Dementors would guard the prison, and in return, they would be allowed to feast on the emotions of the condemned. The cells were cold, the corridors were dark, but the worst part of Azkaban was not the stone or the sea. It was the silence, broken only by the rattling breath of the Dementors as they drifted past the doors. Prisoners forgot their names. They forgot their hopes. They sat in their own despair, the Dementors drawing it out of them like a slow, cold tide. The Ministry had signed a contract with despair itself. There was no rehabilitation here. There was only a slow draining of the self. The walls did not hold the prisoners. Their own sorrows held them. This was the argument that won the day. Security at any cost. Peace purchased with pain. The Dementors did not need to patrol the grounds. The prisoners brought their own prison with them. Inside their minds, they relived their worst moments again and again. The Dementors pulling every happy memory from their grasp until nothing remained but regret. A wizard sentenced to Azkaban was not simply locked away. They were handed over to a force that would strip them of everything they were, piece by piece. For the Ministry, it was a closed case. The problem of a centralized prison had been solved. Azkaban was operational. The Dementors were quiet and efficient. The cost of this efficiency, the slow erasure of human souls, was considered acceptable by the architects of the system. Rowle's cold calculation had proven effective. The prison had a perfect record. No one escaped. No one had the will to try. The island fortress was no longer a secret nightmare. It was an official institution of the wizarding world. The law had been applied. The Dementors kept their watch, and the Ministry, for a time, believed it had solved its problem. But the true nature of this solution, the depth of the bargain that had been struck, would not remain hidden forever within those dark walls. The coldness of the calculation would eventually force others to ask what had truly been sacrificed for this peace. Damocles' Rowle had made his choice. Azkaban would become the wizarding prison of Great Britain. But prison needs guardians, and the only inhabitants of that remote island were the Dementors. The Ministry permitted the Dementors to remain in exchange for their cooperation. This was not a deal struck in a formal chamber, but a quiet understanding. The Dementors would serve as guards, providing security for a prison that seemed otherwise impossible to staff. In return, they would have an endless supply of human misery to feed upon. The prisoners would be kept behind walls, wards, the cold expanse of the sea, and the living nightmares that the Dementors brought with them. Every cell would be a constant assault on the mind. The warmth of a happy memory would become inaccessible, replaced by the cold weight of despair. For the wizarding public, this arrangement created safety. The prison was considered inescapable, with a record of 0 breakouts, but the cost was devastating. Prisoners were not merely confined, they were subjected to a slow, despairing erosion of their very selves. The Dementors drained away hope, leaving only madness and death. The Ministry had traded human lives for security. It was a bargain that would define Azkaban for centuries, a place where punishment turned into torture, and where the line between justice and cruelty blurred into nothing. As the years passed, the walls of Azkaban seemed to absorb the despair. The air grew heavy with sorrow. The sea crashed against the rocks, a constant reminder of isolation. But it was the Dementors who shaped the prison's true character. They fed on every ounce of happiness, leaving behind a void that consumed light and warmth, until all that remained was the dim, cold presence of abandonment. This was the nature of the deal with despair, a system built on the suffering of the few, for the safety of the many, a compromise that weighed heavily on the conscience of the wizarding world, but one that endured because it worked. Within those walls, the boundaries between custodian and captive blurred. The Dementors did not merely guard the prison, they defined it, and the prisoners, trapped in this endless night, soon discovered that the greatest threat was not from without, but from the deep and silent corrosion within. The true story of Azkaban, however, was not found in the Ministry's decisions, but but in the lives of those who were sent there. Their experiences would tell the real cost of this arrangement. For many, the journey began with a trial that was swift, fearful, and sometimes deeply unfair. During times of war, the Ministry of Magic was desperate to identify its enemies. Suspicion spread easily. A familiar face, an old association, or a whispered accusation could be enough to destroy a life. Some of those sent to Azkaban had committed terrible crimes. Others were victims of panic, prejudice, and a justice system willing to sacrifice certainty for the appearance of control. Sirius Black became the most famous example. He was accused of betraying James and Lily Potter to Lord Voldemort and of murdering Peter Pettigrew, along with 12 Muggles. The Wizarding world believed he had committed an act of unimaginable cruelty. He was sent to Azkaban without a proper trial, condemned by evidence that seemed unquestionable at the time. Yet Sirius was innocent. The real traitor was Peter Pettigrew, who had faked his own death and hidden for years in the form of a rat. Sirius survived because he held on to a single truth. He knew he had not betrayed his friends. That knowledge was not a happy thought, and so the Dementors could not consume it in the same way. It was a bitter, furious certainty. It gave him enough strength to endure, though not enough to escape the damage. By the time he fled Azkaban, he was thin, haunted, and changed forever. His escape shattered the belief that the prison was impossible to leave. Before Sirius, no prisoner had escaped Azkaban in its long and terrible history. His success depended on an ability few wizards possessed. As an animagus, he could transform into a large black dog. In that form, his emotions became less human, and the Dementors struggled to sense him clearly. He slipped through the bars, crossed the freezing water, and reached the mainland. But his freedom came with a cruel price. The Ministry did not see an innocent man. It saw a dangerous fugitive, and the fear surrounding his name only grew. Other prisoners were not so fortunate. Bellatrix Lestrange, one of Voldemort's most devoted followers, was sent to Azkaban for torturing Frank and Alice Longbottom into madness. Unlike Sirius, she embraced the darkness around her. The Dementors weakened her body, but they did not break her loyalty to Voldemort. When he returned, he escaped alongside several other Death Eaters, proving that Azkaban's security was only as strong as the creatures guarding it. That escape marked the beginning of the prison's decline. The Dementors had never been loyal to the Ministry. They had been loyal only to the promise of suffering. When Voldemort offered them greater freedom and greater numbers of victims, they abandoned their arrangement with the Wizarding government. The guards of Azkaban became a weapon in the coming war. After Voldemort's defeat, the Ministry finally faced the truth it had avoided for generations. A prison guarded by creatures that fed on human despair could never be called just. The Dementors were removed from Azkaban, and the old system came to an end. The prison remained a place of punishment, but it no longer depended on the deliberate destruction of the people held within it. Even so, the name Azkaban would never lose its power. It remained a symbol of fear, isolation, and the consequences of a society that allowed terror to become policy. Its darkest legacy was not simply that criminals were imprisoned there. It was that innocence offered no protection, remorse offered no comfort, and hope itself could be treated as something to be taken away. The deal was struck. The walls of Ekrizdis' crumbling fortress, the guardianship of the Dementors, and the cold, grey waters of the North Sea would together form the containment that Wizarding law demanded. But a structure this fearsome, a pact this dark, needed a name. It needed a word that would carry the weight of what happened within its stones. And that name, Azkaban, was crafted from two distinct echoes, one drawn from the Muggle world and one from the very depths of spiritual ruin. The first echo is Alcatraz, the name of a real island fortress in the San Francisco Bay, a prison that had become synonymous with isolation, surrounded by tidal currents so cold and treacherous that the water itself acted as a suffocating wall. The very idea of escape was considered impossible, not just by the guards, but by the geography of the place. The echo of inescapable confinement surrounded by an unforgiving sea was woven directly into the fabric of Azkaban. And then there is the second echo, the sound of the name Abaddon. In ancient texts, it is a word for a place of destruction, a bottomless pit, the depths of hell. It is the angel of the abyss, a personification of ruin. To invoke Abaddon is to speak of utter annihilation, not merely of the body, but of the spirit. When these two echoes are combined, you get Azkaban, a name that is not merely a location, but a warning, a promise whispered from parent to child, from ministry official to accused, from the pages of history into the present day. A name that means the prison is an idea as much as a place, an idea of inescapable isolation and spiritual destruction. So, from its very naming, Azkaban carried the weight of a double condemnation. It was a prison you could never leave, cut off from the world by a vast and pitiless sea, and it was a place where the very core of who you were, your happiness, your memory, your will, would be systematically dismantled and destroyed. It was a name that perfectly captured the nature of its guardians. Just as the Dementors drain every positive emotion, the name Azkaban itself seems to drain the light from the word prison. The warning was stark. To be sent to Azkaban was to be erased from the world before you had even died, to be lost to the abyss. And in the centuries that followed, that warning proved itself to be terrifyingly accurate. The prisoners who arrived at its gates, dragged through the fog and salt spray, did not simply serve a sentence. They entered a state of decay, a slow, cold dissolution of the mind. They arrived as witches and wizards, but the Dementors did not take their magic. They took everything else, their memories of warmth, their love for their families, the simple joy of a sunny day. Bit by bit, the Dementors pulled those threads loose until there was nothing left but a hollow shell staring at the wall. And that is where the true story of Azkaban begins. Not with the walls or the wards, with the hollowing out of the soul that awaited everyone inside. Inside Azkaban, time was not measured by clocks, calendars, or the changing of seasons. It was measured by the moments when a prisoner could still remember a face, and the terrible day when that face began to fade. The Dementors made certain that no comfort lasted. A kind word from another cell, a memory of home, even the smallest spark of hope, would draw them near. And when they came, the air grew colder, the darkness seemed heavier, and every happy thought was consumed. For most prisoners, the punishment was not simply confinement, it was forced reliving. The Dementors fed upon happiness, but they left pain behind. They dragged the worst memories to the surface again and again, making guilt feel fresh, making grief feel endless, making terror feel immediate. A prisoner could not escape into sleep, because nightmares waited there. They could not escape into memory, because memory had become a weapon turned against them. This was why Azkaban inspired fear, even among those who had never committed a crime. In the wizarding world, it stood as the final consequence, the place beyond forgiveness, the place where a person could vanish behind a locked door and return, if they returned at all, as someone broken beyond recognition. And yet, for all its terrible reputation, Azkaban was built upon a deeply dangerous compromise. The Ministry of Magic had entrusted its prison to creatures that could not understand justice. Dementors did not know the difference between the guilty and the innocent. They did not care whether a prisoner felt remorse or whether they had been wrongfully condemned. They sensed only human happiness, and they hungered for it. That flaw would haunt Azkaban for generations, because a prison designed to protect society had become dependent on beings that fed upon suffering. The cells held criminals, certainly, but the Dementors were never truly guards. They were predators, waiting just beyond the bars. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The name Azkaban, carrying the weight of destruction implied by its Abaddon roots, was now official policy. The fortress had received its title. The ink was dry on Minister Damocles Rowle's decree. The next step was filling the island with the condemned. The transition from forbidden ruin to a functioning prison was swift and pitiless. Convicts began arriving at the fortress under ministry authority in a steady, grim procession. Small, enchanted ships made the crossing from the mainland, carrying only a handful of souls at a time. An Auror, a ship's captain, and the prisoner who had been deemed too dangerous for the old holding cells. Often, the prisoner arrived already broken by the journey, the sight of the jagged rock rising from the grey sea, stripping away the last threads of hope. They were marched up the slippery stone steps, past the ancient doors carved by Ekrizdis himself, and into the central hall. The first thing they noticed was the absence of sound. The sea was muted. The wind did not whistle. Then came the cold, a chill that seeped into the bone and refused to leave. Then came the presence of the Dementors. The ministry had negotiated with these creatures. They would be the guards. They floated forward to inspect their new charges, and the prisoners felt a numbness that no cloak could ward against. Names were called, chains were struck, and the condemned were herded into the deepest levels of the fortress. The iron doors slammed shut. The darkness was absolute. With every new arrival, the atmosphere of the island grew heavier, a dense fog of despair settling over every stone. The prison quickly earned a reputation worse than execution. In the decades before Azkaban, capital punishment had served as the ultimate deterrent. It was a single, terrible, mercifully brief moment. Azkaban was a sentence that stretched into an eternity of torment. It was an execution that took years. The Wizengamot began to pass sentences of life imprisonment, naive to the true nature of the island. They imagined a prisoner living out their days behind bars. The Dementors, however, expected a meal. The two concepts were fundamentally incompatible. Prisoners were not punished in Azkaban. They were consumed. The Dementors fed on every happy thought, every moment of hope, every spark of sanity. Days melted into a grey haze of misery where no light penetrated. Men and women who had never committed an act of violence found themselves trapped in a world of endless pain, their minds slowly dissolving into nothingness. The words spread like a curse through the wizarding underground. Azkaban was not a prison. It was an abattoir for the soul. It was better to die in a duel. It was better to flee the country. It was better to do anything than to hear the name of that island spoken in the court. Yet the suffering was not confined to the condemned. It radiated outward, poisoning every life it touched. Families learned that a sentence to Azkaban often meant never seeing a loved one truly alive again. The ministry permitted a single visit, a terrible ritual of bureaucratic cruelty, if the family could afford the journey and secure the necessary permissions. But the visit was a hollow ceremony. The prisoner was brought to a cold, empty chamber, a heavy table between them and the person they once knew. The Dementors lurked just beyond the door, their presence a constant, suffocating weight in the room. The prisoner would sit, pale and shaking, sometimes openly weeping, unable to meet their loved one's eyes. The conversation was stilted, filled with long pauses and non-sequiturs. The memories that had bound them together were gone, eaten away by the cold that never lifted. The family member would leave the island, weeping, knowing that the person they had briefly touched was already a ghost. The body was still breathing, the soul was gone. The grief was a living wound that time could not heal. The prison did not just destroy the criminal. It systematically dismantled the families who were left to wait, and the ministry watched this human catastrophe unfold and found it deeply, politically acceptable. The ministry celebrated the prison's apparent security while actively avoiding its human consequences. Not a single prisoner had escaped. The threat to the wizarding world had been neutralized completely. Minister Rowle stood before the Wizengamot and pointed to the statistics, declaring Azkaban an unqualified triumph of magical penology. The cost was easily deniable. The prisoners were the worst of society. Their madness was a natural consequence of their evil. The despair was just another form of justice. The few dissenting voices, those who had seen the hollow eyes of the prisoners, or heard the sobs of a mother in the ministry atrium, were drowned out by the roar of approval from a populace that felt genuinely safe for the first time in years. The ministry convened celebratory committees, published glowing economic reports, and congratulated itself on its ingenuity. The Dementors were the perfect solution. They were self-sufficient. They required no salary, no rotation of exhausted auras, no oversight. They asked for nothing but the misery of the condemned. The first years of the new prison set a terrible, unshakable precedent. They established a status quo of sanctioned cruelty that would persist for more than 2 centuries. Azkaban became the dark heart of wizarding Britain's justice system, a beating heart of cold stone, salt water, and darker magic. The fortress had been tamed, or so the ministry believed, but the primal darkness that Ekrizdis had cultivated there was not dormant. It was ancient, patient, and deeply aware. The Dementors served the ministry for now, but they answered to their own nature, a nature that was fundamentally opposed to life itself. The ministry had placed a leash on a wolf, but the leash was held by a hand that had convinced itself it was in control. The island, the fortress, and the nameless things that drifted through its halls had a will of their own, a hunger that was growing with every prisoner delivered. This barbaric equilibrium was now the law of the land. The system ground on year after year, decade after decade. The carousel of suffering turned without interruption, without remorse. Prisoners were sent, families grieved, and the ministry turned a collective blind eye, filing the reports and moving on to the next item on the agenda. But shadows have a way of growing in the dark. The shadow cast by Azkaban was long enough to cover the entire wizarding world. The compromises made in these early, formative years were not isolated choices. They were seeds planted in poisoned ground. They would echo through the centuries, influencing every subsequent minister for magic, every political scandal, every war against darkness that followed. The fortress of Ekrizdis had not been cleansed. It had not been subdued. It had simply been reopened, and it had become a living parasite on the soul of magical Britain, a wound that the ministry had convinced itself was a necessary triumph. The previous chapter traced the first arrivals at the fortress, how the ministry established its new authority over the remote island. The prison quickly earned a reputation as a fate worse than execution. It was not simply a prison. In the dark pubs of Diagon Alley and in the hushed corridors of the ministry, it was described as a place where the soul itself was slowly dismantled. The gallows or the axe offered a swift end. Azkaban was a sentence that did not truly finish, not even when the body finally gave out. For a prisoner arriving on that cold shore, the real interrogation began before a single question was asked. It began the moment the iron door sealed shut. Let us consider what that cell contained. There was no window, no torch, no source of light. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight pressing against the eyes. You could not see your own hand in front of your face. The only sensation was the cold. The black stone leached warmth directly from the body, slowly and without mercy. Hour after hour, the cold crept deeper into the bones. The floor was bare rock. There was no bed for most prisoners, just a hard slab worn smooth by those who had come before. Hunger followed, the silence broken only by the scrape of a slot opening in the iron door. The food was brought in precisely, so that no one starved too quickly, yet no one ever felt full. The isolation was complete. The walls were immensely thick. The only sounds were the groan of the sea against the cliffs, and the occasional, terrible shriek from another cell echoing through the stone. But it was the Dementors that made the prison truly inescapable. They did not simply patrol the corridors. They pressed close against the iron grates in the doors. You felt their presence before they fully materialized. A drop in temperature, a thickening of the air, a sudden crushing cold that had nothing to do with the stone walls. They pressed in so close, they seemed to breathe the air from your lungs. They pressed close enough to smother every comforting thought. The mind unprotected began to erode. The Dementors did not need to use force. They simply reached past the stone and the iron, and touch the memories inside a person's head. Every happy memory, the warmth of a fire, the taste of a meal you loved, the sound of a friend's voice, was dragged into the open and drained of every ounce of feeling. The memory did not vanish immediately. It first turned cold, distant, unreal. You knew it had happened, but the feeling of it was gone. The warmth was gone. Prisoners could not hold on to the memories that once made life bearable. Over time, everything good was stripped away. The Dementors did not create misery. They simply cleared away everything else until there was nothing left to look at but the deepest regrets, the sharpest griefs, the ugliest failures. A prisoner would relive the worst moment of their life, constantly, without any break. There was no escape into sleep. Sleep was just a deeper room in the prison, where the Dementors could still find you. The worst memory played on an infinite loop, and the walls of the cell seemed to shrink around it. The stone walls became secondary to the walls built inside the mind. The mind became its own locked cell. Inside this space, a person slowly forgot who they were. Names lost their meaning, faces blurred. The concept of a future became abstract, then impossible. What was the point of waiting? What was the point of hoping for a tomorrow that held nothing but the same cold, the same darkness, the same draining of the soul? The hunger for food was overwhelmed by the stale, cold air. The will to live was simply consumed. Prisoners stopped eating. They stopped moving. They simply waited for the forgetting to reach its final end. This was the standard condition of life in Azkaban. The fortress operated exactly as the agreement intended. The Dementors had their steady supply of emotion, and the Ministry had their secure prison, a fortress no one escaped. Most prisoners succumbed entirely to this erasure of the self, their minds dissolving into a permanent fog of despair. But within this system of total hopelessness, a very small number of prisoners found a way to exist without being wholly consumed. Their survival depended on a single desperate anchor, something the Dementors could not find, something the cold and the stone and the forgetting could not touch. To understand the true nature of Azkaban, we have to understand what happens when the smothering of comforting thoughts is no longer an occasional assault, but a permanent state of being. The cold and the darkness are merely the setting. The terrible architecture is merely the frame. The true punishment is something far more deliberate. Azkaban's punishment is not only confinement, but the systematic removal of hope. Hope is the engine of the human mind. It is what allows a person to look beyond the current moment of suffering and believe that a better one lies ahead. It is the one thing that makes confinement bearable. In Azkaban, the Dementors do not simply take this away, they turn the mind against itself. Inmates are forced to remember shame, loss, terror, and grief with unbearable clarity. Every mistake you ever made, every moment of humiliation, every loss you ever suffered, and every fear you ever suppressed is dragged to the surface and held there under an unblinking light. There is no distraction. There is no relief. You do not simply think about your worst memory. You live inside it fully and permanently. The same regret plays on an endless loop. The same face of someone you failed stares at you from the darkness. The same terror of a moment you once survived is made to feel imminent again and again. This is the sentence. This is what makes Azkaban a destination worse than execution. Execution ends the suffering. Azkaban makes suffering the entire purpose of the sentence. The Ministry outsourced punishment to creatures who feed on despair, and the terms of that arrangement required the complete destruction of the self. Hope is also what makes us reach for the next meal. Hope is what makes us get up from a fall. When the Dementors have systematically removed that hope from the equation, the body receives no signal to continue. Many stop eating because they no longer believe survival matters. The will to live is a fragile thread, and in Azkaban it is deliberately severed. The prisoners waste away not from starvation alone, but from a total absence of reason to take the next bite. This is the end game of the system. Insanity and death become common endings to a prison term. Some prisoners claw at the walls until their fingers bleed. Some sit in a corner and never move again. Some laugh without stopping, the sound echoing off the stone until it becomes indistinguishable from sobbing. The Dementors do not care what form the madness takes, only that the emotional energy continues to flow. The despair of a madman is just as nourishing as the sorrow of a sane one. Death in this place is often the only mercy, but it is a mercy that takes time. The length of a sentence is irrelevant to the Dementors. A 10-year sentence can feel like a century. A life sentence is simply a slow death. It is vital to understand that this was not a flaw in the system. This was the system itself. Damocles, Rowle, and the Ministry of Magic did not turn Azkaban into a prison despite the Dementors. They built the prison around them. They accepted the cost. The cost was the complete dehumanization of every prisoner. Security was absolute. No one could escape a place where the guards could plant your deepest shame directly into your mind the moment you thought of freedom. For decades, this brutal cycle held. The Ministry of Magic relied on the Dementors' despair to guarantee order. No one could escape a prison that tore every happy thought from your mind as soon as it formed. The sea kept the island isolated. The Dementors kept the prisoners broken. But a cycle as cruel as this, built entirely on the consumption of human hope, has an inherent fragility. Despair is powerful, but it is not absolute. There are forces the Dementors cannot fully consume, and minds they cannot fully break. One of those forces is a love so deeply rooted that even grief cannot erase it. Another is a mind that has learned to divide itself from pain. And sometimes the thing that protects a prisoner is not happiness at all, but rage. Sirius Black became the clearest proof that Azkaban was not infallible. He survived because he held onto a single truth with a desperate, sharpened clarity. He was innocent. That knowledge was not a happy thought. It could not produce a Patronus, but it gave him something the Dementors struggled to understand. His pain had a target outside himself. He was not simply drowning in guilt or regret. He was angry. He had been betrayed, imprisoned, and blamed for crimes committed by another man. The Dementors could sense his misery, but they could not entirely consume the conviction beneath it. His animagus form gave him another advantage. As a dog, his emotions became less complex, less recognizably human, and therefore less satisfying to the Dementors. He could slip through the bars in a body small enough to escape his cell, then swim through the freezing sea toward freedom. His escape was extraordinary, but it revealed something deeply troubling. The supposedly perfect prison had always depended on one assumption: that every inmate would eventually surrender internally. Sirius did not surrender, and once that assumption was broken, the entire logic of Azkaban began to collapse. The Ministry had treated the Dementors as tools, believing that fear could be controlled, so long as it was pointed at the right people. But creatures that feed on despair do not possess loyalty in any human sense. They do not care about justice, evidence, or the difference between the guilty and the innocent. They serve whoever offers them access to suffering. That truth became impossible to ignore when Lord Voldemort returned. The Dementors did not remain faithful to the Ministry out of duty. They abandoned it because Voldemort promised them a world with more terror, more grief, and more souls to consume. The guards of Azkaban had never been guardians at all. They were predators temporarily contained by an agreement. When that agreement failed, Azkaban became what it had always threatened to become: not a prison, but a breeding ground for darkness. The mass breakout that followed was not merely a security failure. It was the predictable consequence of building justice on the backs of monsters. Dangerous prisoners returned to the world, and the Ministry was forced to confront the fact that it had allowed the Dementors to become stronger for generations. After the war, the use of Dementors at Azkaban was finally ended. It was a necessary change, but it could not undo the suffering already inflicted. Those who had spent years in those cells carried the prison with them. Some returned unable to speak about what they had endured. Some never truly returned at all. Azkaban had not only held bodies behind walls, it had reshaped minds, memories, and identities. That is why Azkaban remains one of the darkest institutions in the wizarding world. Its horror was never just that people were locked away on a cold island. Its horror was the belief that a person could be punished by having every source of inner light stripped from them. It was a system that confused cruelty with safety and despair with justice. And in the end, Azkaban's greatest lesson is not about magic. It is about what happens when a society decides that some people no longer deserve hope. The Ministry of Magic knew what was happening inside Azkaban. They had known since the very first prisoner was locked behind those freezing walls. The conditions were not a mystery. They were a matter of record. But knowing and acting are two very different things. And the Ministry chose a path of deliberate, convenient silence. To understand this choice, we have to go back to the very beginning, when the Ministry first discovered Azkaban in the 15th century, following the death of the dark wizard Ekrizdis. They found a fortress saturated with despair. Ekrizdis had lured Muggle sailors to the island for decades, torturing them and performing unspeakable experiments. The Dementors had flocked to the island like scavengers to a wound, and they had stayed, feeding on the residual agony. The Ministry did not know what to do with the place. They sealed it, left it to the Dementors, and hoped it would simply be forgotten. But the needs of the wizarding world changed. The International Statute of Secrecy made it dangerous to maintain small, scattered prisons in the heart of Muggle communities. A single isolated facility was the logical answer, and so in 1718, Minister for Magic Damocles Rowle turned his gaze back to the abandoned fortress in the North Sea. Rowle was a pragmatist and a cold one. He saw the Dementors not as an infestation, but as an opportunity. He struck a bargain. The Dementors would be allowed to stay. They would be the guards. In exchange, they would feed on the emotions of the prisoners. The Ministry would pay nothing for security, and the prison would be virtually inescapable. The officials who implemented this system knew exactly what it meant. They knew that a Dementor does not simply guard a cell. It invades a mind. It drains joy. It leaves its victim trapped in an endless loop of their worst memories. It is not a punishment that ends when the sentence is over. It is a punishment that systematically erases the person being punished. The Ministry documented this. They understood the mechanism, and they accepted it. Eldritch Diggory became minister in 1733. He did what no minister had done before. He visited Azkaban. He walked the cold stone corridors and felt the Dementors pass. He saw the prisoners, many already lost, their eyes hollow, their bodies wasting away. He spoke to the keepers, if they could be called that. He came back horrified. Diggory argued that Azkaban was not a prison. It was a torture chamber. He pushed for reforms, even closure. But Diggory was a single voice against a system that had already proven its value. What was that value? The 0 breakout rate. It was the single most powerful argument in the Ministry's arsenal. No prisoner had ever escaped Azkaban. In a world terrified of dark wizards, of Grindelwald's shadow, of the chaos that followed the Statute of Secrecy, this statistic was absolute. Any critic of the conditions inside could be met with the same simple question: would you rather they be free? The public safety argument was a wall that no reformer could scale. The Ministry could stand before the Wizengamot, before the press, before the public, and declare with perfect confidence that the system worked. It was harsh, but it worked. And so, public safety was repeatedly placed above the humanity of the imprisoned. The Ministry did not sentence criminals to confinement. They sentenced them to a slow psychological execution, outsourced to creatures that enjoyed the work. There was no rehabilitation. There was no hope. There was only the cold, the dark, and the Dementors. The system was defended because it was efficient. It was cheap. It required no oral presence on site, no complex warding against escape attempts. The Dementors did all the work. The silence from the Ministry was not an embarrassment. It was a policy. This policy was protected by a deeply cynical reality. The prison survives because its victims are too broken to tell their own stories. By the time a prisoner served their time, if they served it at all, they were incapable of testimony. They emerged as husks. Their minds had been stripped bare by despair. They could not speak coherently about their suffering. Even if they could, who would believe the ravings of a soul that had been systematically unmade? The ministry had constructed a perfect closed loop. The very process of imprisonment destroyed the prisoner's credibility. The system broke the witnesses, and the broken witnesses could not testify against the system. For nearly 300 years, this silence held. The paperwork for Azkaban was notoriously thin. A name, a crime, a sentence. There were no detailed reports on the inmate's mental state. No requests for medical intervention. The ministry did not want to know. They had created a system of perfect plausible deniability. The fortress swallowed its prisoners and gave nothing back, not even a whisper. The convenience of this silence is difficult to overstate. It allowed the ministry to claim moral authority while outsourcing the filthiest work to soulless entities. It allowed the public to feel safe without having to confront the cost of that safety. It allowed the entire wizarding legal system to pretend that justice was being served, when in reality, a slow bureaucratic murder was being carried out in their name, wave after wave, year after year. But a closed system, one built entirely on silence, inevitably develops a pressure that must escape. The ministry's convenient silence insulated Azkaban from oversight. It protected the prison from reform, but it also made the ministry profoundly blind to its own weaknesses. The silence did not just keep the outside world from hearing the screams. It kept the ministry from seeing the cracks forming in the foundation. The zero breakout rate was a powerful shield, but shields can also blind the bearer, and the history of Azkaban was about to enter a new phase, one in which the silence would finally be broken by the very men and women it was meant to contain. The ministry had perfected the art of looking away. They buried the reports. They praised the zero breakout rate. They allowed the silence of Azkaban to justify its horrors. But every now and then, a conscience stirs. Between the years 1733 and 1747, a man named Eldritch Diggory became Minister for Magic. He was a reformer, a man who believed in the rule of law, not the rule of fear, and so he decided to do what no minister had done before. He went to Azkaban. He sailed to the island on a grey morning. The fortress emerged from the fog like a bad memory. He walked through the gates, and the Dementors drew back, just slightly, respecting his office. But they did not leave. They hovered at the edges of his vision, waiting. What Minister Eldritch Diggory saw inside Azkaban defied his understanding of justice. He witnessed the despair. He walked through wards where prisoners no longer spoke, where they simply sat in the cold and wept. He saw the madness, the way the Dementors had hollowed out entire floors of inmates, leaving them as shells that stared at nothing. He saw the emotional ruin. A man who had been sentenced for debt now clutched his own head and screamed for a mother who had died years ago. The Dementors had amplified his grief until it was all he could feel. Diggory was horrified. It was not a shock of the new. It was the slow dawning horror of realizing that his own government had normalized this. They had signed papers. They had approved budgets. They had sent human beings here to be destroyed. When he returned to London, he could not contain the truth. He stood before the Wizengamot and declared that Azkaban was not a prison. It was torture administered by the state. He described the cold, the forgetting, the endless presence of the Dementors pressing against the soul. He demanded change. He demanded that the Dementors be removed, that human guards be installed, that the prison be reformed or closed. The Wizengamot listened. They were uncomfortable. They were disturbed, but they were not moved. The arguments against change were too strong. It was too expensive. It was too difficult. And above all, it worked. No one escaped. To reform Azkaban was to risk escapes. So they thanked Minister Diggory for his report, and they filed it away. Diggory continued his fight for a time, but he was a man against a mountain. The inertia of the ministry was absolute. He left office with his reforms unpassed, his warnings unheard. He had opened the door to Azkaban, but the Ministry had refused to look. The system he tried to break simply continued. The Dementors remained. The prisoners continued to fade. The silence of the state was restored, and the truth about Azkaban returned to the shadows, where it would wait for someone else to find it and to survive it. For generations afterward, Azkaban became something the wizarding world mentioned in lowered voices. It was not discussed as a place with cells, routines, appeals, or rehabilitation. It was spoken of as an ending. If a witch or wizard was sent there, families mourned them as though they were already dead. That reputation was not an accident. It was the prison's true purpose. Azkaban did not merely contain criminals. It terrified everyone outside its walls. Every child who heard the name understood the lesson: obey the Ministry, fear the punishment. Do not ask what happens on the island. And so the prison became easier to defend with every passing year. The more dreadful it was, the more effective it seemed. Officials could point to the absence of escapes and call it success. They could ignore the broken minds, the suicides, and the prisoners who emerged unable to remember their own names. They could insist that the worst people deserved the worst fate. But Azkaban did not distinguish neatly between the guilty and the innocent. It could not. The Dementors did not care about evidence. They did not care whether a sentence was fair, whether a trial had been corrupt, or whether the prisoner had ever committed a crime at all. To them, every human being was simply a source of warmth to be consumed. That was the great danger, hidden beneath the Ministry's confidence. A justice system can survive mistakes only when those mistakes can be corrected. Azkaban offered no such mercy. An innocent person sent to the island did not simply lose years of freedom. They lost the inner strength required to prove the truth. They lost hope. They lost memory. And sometimes they lost the will to live long before anyone outside admitted an error had been made. The fortress stood as proof of a darker principle. When fear becomes more important than justice, cruelty no longer needs to be explained. It only needs to be called necessary. By the time the modern wizarding world entered its most dangerous years, the warnings of Eldritch Diggory had become little more than forgotten history. The Ministry still relied on the Dementors. It still believed it controlled them. It still treated them as guards rather than predators. That belief would prove disastrously wrong, because the Dementors had never served the Ministry out of loyalty. They had accepted the arrangement because Azkaban fed them. The prisoners were their payment, and when a greater source of fear appeared in the world, they would have no reason to remain faithful to the people who had once given them an island of suffering. Eldritch Diggory carried the memory of Azkaban out with him, and it did not fade in the sunlight or the salt air. It clung to him, a chill he could not shake, a silence he could not fill. He had walked the long corridors of the fortress, had stood in the presence of the Dementors, and had looked into the faces of the men and women the Ministry had entrusted to their care. What he found there was not justice. It was a slow, methodical eradication of the self. He returned to London with a single conviction: this place must be closed. But the Ministry of Magic, as an institution, was not built to act on conviction alone. It was built to consider, to debate, to weigh risks, and most of all, to maintain the status quo. And so, despite Diggory's alarm, despite his appeals to the Wizengamot, despite the vivid horror of his testimony, Azkaban remains open. The arguments against his proposal were grounded in a terrible, pragmatic logic. The Ministry fears that removing the Dementors from Azkaban could unleash them upon the mainland. This was not a paranoid fantasy, but a calculated risk. Dementors are not loyal in the way a guard or a watchman is loyal. They are not bound by oath or duty. They serve because they are fed. Remove their source of sustenance, the constant despair of the prisoners, and they will seek it elsewhere. The towns and villages of Britain, full of unsuspecting warmth and joy, would become a vast hunting ground. The Ministry could not risk a catastrophe of that scale, a horror that could not be contained. The Dementors were a plague, and Azkaban was the quarantine. To open the quarantine was unthinkable. Beyond the fear of escape, there was the crushing weight of simple expense. No alternative prison appears as secure or as inexpensive as the fortress the Dementors already guarded. The cost of building a new prison from the foundation stones up would be immense, a drain on the treasury that few ministers were willing to propose to the Wizengamot. The cost of hiring and training a full battalion of dedicated human guards, of paying their salaries year after year, of regularly rotating them back to the mainland to prevent the slow madness of the island from claiming them, was a recurring, permanent expense the ministry had never been forced to confront. The Dementors required no wages. They required no leave. They required no comfort or consideration. They fed on the very thing the prison produced in abundance. They were, in the strictest accounting of galleons and sickles, the most efficient security force the wizarding world could ever hope to employ. And so the institution endures, because every solution seems more dangerous than inaction. This is the central, grinding paradox of Azkaban. Everyone who mattered knew the truth. The prison was not a place of punishment. It was a chamber of systematic psychological torture. The reports were there, written in the careful, neutral language of bureaucracy, describing cold stone walls that sweated dampness and a silence so deep that men forgot their own names. They described alarming rates of insanity, of complete catatonia, of prisoners simply losing the will to open their eyes. The testimony of the few who managed to survive their sentences spoke of Dementors gliding past the doors, pressing close enough that the warmth of a memory would flicker and die, replaced by the crushing weight of every failure, every shame, every loss the prisoner had ever known. The ministry read these reports. They knew the truth, but the risk of reform, the cost of it, the fear of what might be unleashed, all combined to create a wall that good intentions and moral outrage could not breach. The committees weighed the evidence and concluded, again and again, that the most prudent course available was to do nothing at all. The suffering of the prisoners was an abstract tragedy, a distant problem for another administration to solve. The escape of the Dementors into the wider world was a concrete, immediate apocalypse. The ministry chose the tragedy they could hide over the chaos they could not control. They chose the slow death of the few over the potential devastation of the many. This was the choice that defined Azkaban. It was not a failure of oversight. It was not a lapse in judgment. It was a conscious decision, renewed with every passing generation, to maintain a system that was efficient, secure, and utterly inhumane. The story of the prison is not a story of stone and iron. It is a story of choices. Choices made in quiet London rooms, by tired officials, under the weight of convenient excuses and pressing budgets. And so the fortress remained, a dark speck on the grey horizon of the North Sea. The decades passed. The name of Eldritch Diggory faded from the daily business of the ministry into a historical footnote. A footnote about a man who had tried to open a door and found it bolted shut by a combination of fear and frugality. The Dementors continued their silent, gliding patrol along the jagged cliffs. The ministry continued to send its convicted, and into that cold, unchanging silence, the prisoners disappeared. They were not sent to be rehabilitated. They were not sent to serve a debt to society. They were sent into a void, a grey emptiness where hope went to die. The Dementors did not care about guilt or innocence. They did not distinguish between the worst murderer and the smallest debtor. They only hungered for the warmth inside a living mind, and the ministry, having weighed every option, having weighed every cost, chose to allow them to feed. The ministry's fear of the Dementors became the prison's deepest foundation. They needed to keep the creatures contained, so they built an entire philosophy of incarceration around their nature. The isolation of the island, the wards laid across the water, the biting cold of the North Sea. These were practical advantages, yes, but the real architecture of confinement was psychological. For generations, Azkaban is treated as escape-proof, not merely difficult to flee, but conceptually impossible. The sea, wards, isolation and Dementors combine into a reputation of absolute confinement. This reputation was not earned through stone alone. It was earned through something much more insidious. The Dementors do not just guard the prison. They are the prison. Every happy memory slowly bleeds away, leaving only the worst moments of a life playing on an endless loop. How could anyone plan an escape when they cannot even remember the face of a loved one? How could anyone find the will to act when every thought is consumed by shame and regret? The Ministry understood this perfectly. It was the core of the system. A prisoner in Azkaban spent their days sinking deeper into a fog that left no room for hope, let alone rebellion. This was the theory, and it held. Yet the prison's strength depends on a fatal assumption. Every inmate will break before they can plan, and most did. The silent majority of Azkaban's population simply faded away, dying of despair, their names forgotten. But an institution built entirely on an assumption is a fragile thing. Despair is a weapon, but it is a blunt one. It strikes everyone, but it does not break everyone in the same way. The story begins to reveal that despair is powerful, but not perfect. A man consumed by grief can become numb to it. A man driven by a specific purpose can learn to feed the Dementors only the surface of his pain, hiding the core of his identity away where the creatures cannot reach. A man who has already lost everything has nothing left for the Dementors to take. The very depths of the prison's despair, its ultimate weapon, could become a shield. When a prisoner discovers that the Dementors do not see him, but only feel him, a strange kind of freedom emerges. He can move through the corridors of the fortress, through the fog and the cold, not as a broken soul, but as a shadow. The walls do not see him. The sea does not care about him. The only thing that mattered was the assumption of absolute despair, and that assumption held until it did not. When that moment came, the reputation of the inescapable prison shattered, not through an army, but through a single act of will that the Dementors never saw coming. The question was not whether Azkaban could be escaped, but what kind of man could survive the attempt. That man was Sirius Black. For 12 years, the Ministry believed he was exactly where he belonged. They believed the Dementors had reduced him to the same hollow state as every other prisoner. But Sirius possessed something Azkaban had never accounted for, the certainty that he was innocent. He did not have happiness to protect him. He had rage. He had the image of Peter Pettigrew alive and free, wearing the face of a harmless rat, while Sirius suffered for his crimes. That knowledge became an anchor. Whenever the Dementors drew near and forced his mind toward pain, Sirius could return to one simple truth. He had not betrayed James and Lily Potter. The real traitor was still out there. It was not a happy thought. It could not drive the Dementors away, but it gave him clarity. It reminded him that his misery had a cause, and that cause had a name. In Azkaban, where so many prisoners lost the ability to distinguish memory from nightmare, Sirius held on to a purpose. Then came the crucial advantage. Sirius was an animagus, capable of transforming into a great black dog. In that form, his mind became simpler, less human, and therefore less visible to the Dementors. They could sense despair, but they did not understand the difference between one animal and another. To them, Sirius in his dog form was weaker, smaller, and far less significant than the man they believed they were guarding. Years passed before the opportunity arrived. A newspaper delivered to Azkaban carried a photograph of the Weasley family, and in that photograph, Sirius saw Peter Pettigrew. He saw the rat perched on Ron Weasley's shoulder, missing one toe from a paw. Suddenly his purpose became urgent. Peter was not merely alive. He was at Hogwarts, close to Harry. Sirius did not escape to save himself. He escaped because Harry was in danger. He transformed, slipped through the narrow opening of his cell, and entered the freezing sea. The journey should have killed him. The cold water, the distance, and the exhaustion were terrible enough. But Azkaban had already reduced him to skin and bone. In his animal form, Sirius was thin enough to pass where a human body could not. And because the Dementors failed to recognize the meaning of his escape, They did not stop him in time. When he reached the mainland, the impossible had happened. A prisoner had escaped Azkaban. The Ministry's response was panic, not because Sirius had broken out alone, but because his escape exposed a truth they could not control. Their perfect prison was not perfect. The Dementors were not infallible. The system had relied on terror and reputation, and one man had proved that both could fail. Sirius Black became a symbol of danger across Britain, but in reality, he was evidence of Azkaban's weakness. He showed that the prison could crush a person's spirit, but it could not always destroy a person's purpose. For generations, Azkaban was treated as escape-proof. The sea, the wards, the isolation, and the Dementors combined into an unshakable reputation of absolute confinement. But in the aftermath of Voldemort's first fall, the fortress found itself facing a test it had never endured before. It was asked to hold those who did not merely fear the Dark Lord, but who worshipped him, those whose devotion ran so deep that even the Dementors might struggle to reach them. After Voldemort vanished, the Ministry moved quickly. Notorious Death Eaters were rounded up and sent to stand trial. Among the most prominent were Bellatrix Lestrange, her husband Rodolphus, his brother Rabaston, and their ally Barty Crouch Jr. Their crime was not mere membership in a dark organisation. It was the sustained torture and violence inflicted upon Frank and Alice Longbottom, two of the most respected auras of the age. Using the Cruciatus Curse, they tore apart the minds of their victims until nothing remained. The Wizengamot showed no mercy. The Lestranges and their accomplices were given life sentences in Azkaban, the harshest punishment the Ministry could offer. The minister at the time, Barty Crouch Sr., declared that there would be no leniency. They were to be locked away, removed from the world entirely. Inside Azkaban, the rules of ordinary confinement did not apply. The Dementors set to work on the new arrivals. They exerted their hollowing pressure, pulling at every happy memory, every flicker of warmth. Most prisoners crumbled within weeks. They lost the will to speak, to eat, to exist. But the Lestranges did not crumble. Their devotion to their fallen master survived even the Dementors' assault. They did not hold on to happy memories, because their happiness had been built entirely around Voldemort and his cause. The Dementors could not take what was not there. Instead of despair, the prisoners fed their minds on hope, the hope that the Dark Lord would return, that his power was not ended, merely hidden. The prison contained them physically. The stone walls held their bodies. The Dementors patrolled their corridors. But inside their minds, the fanaticism continued to burn. It was not weakened by confinement. It was refined by it. Every day in Azkaban was designed to break a person. The cold, the silence punctuated by screams, the draining of all positive emotion. It turned prisoners into shells. The Lestranges, particularly Bellatrix, became notorious even among the other inmates. She would sit in her cell and whisper praises to her lord, or shout defiance at the walls. The Dementors could not starve her of hope, because hope was entirely invested in a man who they themselves could not touch. She drew strength from her rage. She cultivated her hatred like a garden, where other prisoners forgot the faces of their loved ones. She sharpened every memory of serving her master. Azkaban was meant to be the end of the line. It was built to destroy people, but for the faithful, it became a crucible. It stripped away everything except the core of their obsession. It could not erase their fanaticism. It only drove it deeper. This created a dangerous dynamic behind the walls of the fortress. The Ministry believed that the prison was doing its work simply by holding them. Crouch Sr. spoke of them as though they were already dead, their names sealed in a vault. But the fanaticism did not fade. It waited, and while the Lestranges sat and waited in Azkaban, a single cell away, another prisoner harboured his own desperate secret. A man who was not faithful to the Dark Lord at all, but who had been condemned by the same system, and who was not content to wait. The quiet that settled over the upper levels of Azkaban was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of a held breath, waiting for the moment when the faith of some and the fury of others would finally collide with the walls that held them. That man was Sirius Black. Unlike the Death Eaters, Sirius had no faith in Voldemort's return. What kept him alive was something far colder and more immediate. The knowledge that Peter Pettigrew was free and that Harry Potter remained in danger. The imprisonment of Bellatrix Lestrange and her husband Rodolphus was a victory the Ministry could not fully enjoy. The case was won, the Dark Wizards were sent to the island, but the trial had left a deeper stain on the record. A stain that no amount of Ministry pride could wash away. Among those sentenced alongside them for the shared crime of torturing Frank and Alice Longbottom was a young man whose very name was an accusation directed at the institution itself, Barty Crouch Jr. His father was Barty Crouch Sr., the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the man who had built the case against the Dark Wizards, the man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice, was now forced to confront the terrible truth that his own son was one of them. The son of the law was a lawbreaker. The heir to the Crouch name was convicted of breaking the minds of two of the most respected Aurors in living memory. Aurors who had defied the Dark Lord 3 times. Frank and Alice Longbottom were legends in the wizarding community. The attack on them was not just a crime, it was a statement. The Death Eaters wanted to prove that no one was beyond their reach. The Cruciatus Curse was used until their minds were shattered. They were left as empty shells, their memories destroyed, their lives stolen, unable to recognize their own son, Neville, who was raised by his grandmother in the wake of their collapse. The crime was so severe that the entire wizarding world demanded justice. The Wizengamot had no mercy. Barty Crouch Jr. was sentenced to life in Azkaban. The sentencing was a public spectacle. Barty Crouch Sr. had to sit in judgment of his own son. The newspapers reported every word. The shame of the Crouch family was complete. He was sent to Azkaban, thrown into the same freezing darkness that swallowed the Lestranges, bound for the same slow decay of the soul. The cold stone of the island became his home. The Dementors became his only companions. The despair of that place began to settle into his bones. That the escape of Barty Crouch Jr. was not a single event. It was a quiet erosion of the prison's defences, carried out by a dying woman and a powerful man ashamed of his own blood. His mother, Mrs. Crouch, was terminally ill. She was a shadow of a woman, fading slowly as the illness consumed her. But the loss of her son was a faster death. She had watched him be sentenced to life in the most terrible place in the wizarding world. She decided that she would not let him die there alone. She would take his place inside the stone walls. The plan required influence. It required the power of the Ministry to turn a blind eye. Barty Crouch Sr. used his status to arrange a private visit to the island. He smuggled in Polyjuice Potion, the magical substance that could allow one person to become another, wear another's face, to live another's life. In the depths of Azkaban, under the vacant, drifting watch of the Dementors, a mother and her son exchanged identities. The transformation was painful, but necessary. She took his face, his youth, his guilt. He took hers, her age, her frailty, her freedom. The switch was made. The mother stayed. The son left. The Dementors did not notice. They could not see beyond the surface of the emotions they fed upon. They felt the mother's profound despair, the sorrow of her illness, and her willing sacrifice. They did not question the change. When she finally died in that cold, wet cell, the Dementors recorded the passing of Barty Crouch Jr. The Ministry closed the case. The prisoner was officially dead. The world believed the young Death Eater had perished in Azkaban, a victim of the very prison that was supposed to contain him. But the truth was far more sinister. Barty Crouch Jr. walked free, but not truly free. He was hidden in plain sight, kept under his father's imperious curse, a secret prisoner in his own home, a ghost behind the walls of the Crouch family estate. He was a living corpse, buried in a lie, free from Azkaban, but imprisoned by his father's will. The escape was a perfect deception. It demonstrated that the fortress of Azkaban, for all its terror and isolation, was vulnerable to a simple truth. A mother's love could outlast the consuming cruelty of the Dementors. A family's loyalty could fracture the reputation of the Ministry and the supposed infallibility of its prison system. The Dementors could not understand sacrifice. They could not see love. They could only feel despair. The secret of Barty Crouch Jr. was a crack in the stone of Azkaban's myth. The Ministry had proven that the perfect prison was only perfect when no one bothered to look closely. The deception of the Crouch family showed that Azkaban was not a fortress of absolute justice. It was a place where the powerful could hide their secrets, where the bonds of blood could warp the system of law. The escape was a failure of the system that the Ministry could not afford to acknowledge. For years, the escape of Barty Crouch Jr. remained a ghost story, unknown to all but a few. The truth was buried deep within the Ministry's own records, hidden by a father's shame and an institution's refusal to admit a devastating failure. But the flaw was there. The perfect prison had a weakness. The escape of Barty Crouch Jr. proved that Azkaban could be beaten. It required the ultimate sacrifice. It required a love so strong that it could deceive the creatures of despair. The Ministry buried this truth, hoping the secret would never surface. But the flaw had been made. The system of absolute confinement had been broken, and it was only a matter of time before someone else found the cracks. The escape of Barty Crouch Jr. was a secret known only to a handful of people. The Ministry remained blissfully unaware that Azkaban had been breached. As far as they knew, the prison was still the flawless cage it had always been. But the illusion of perfect security was about to crack. The public did not know about the Junior Crouch, but they were about to learn a name that would become synonymous with treachery and despair. The fall of the Dark Lord should have been a time of pure celebration, but the joy was short-lived. News spread that the Potters were dead. The wizarding world mourned their heroes. And then the whispers started. Who betrayed them? How did Voldemort find them? The Ministry's investigation was swift and brutal. They had a suspect within days. In 1981, Sirius Black was sent to Azkaban after Voldemort's first defeat. The Ministry had no doubts about his guilt. He was believed to have betrayed James and Lily Potter to Voldemort. The evidence was circumstantial at its best and manufactured by the true culprit, but it was damning enough. He was also blamed for the deaths of Peter Pettigrew and 12 Muggles, a massacre that had been staged perfectly to frame him. He did not defend himself. He did not protest. He stood in the ruins of the Muggle Street, laughing. It was the laughter of a broken man who had just realized the true scope of his failure. He had trusted the wrong person, and now his best friend was dead. That laughter was all the confession the Ministry needed. To the wizarding world, Sirius Black became the most hated prisoner in Britain. He was loathed more than the convicted Death Eaters who had tortured the Longbottoms, more than anyone who had ever served the Dark Lord, because his crime was the worst of them all. He had betrayed his own flesh and blood, his best friend. His face was on the front page of the Daily Prophet for weeks. The articles painted him as the worst kind of monster, a Death Eater who had wormed his way into the Order of the Phoenix, who had pretended to be James Potter's best friend while secretly serving the Dark Lord. Parents used his name to scare their children into behaving. "You do not want to end up like Sirius Black," they would whisper. He became a symbol, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting the wrong people. There was no trial for Sirius Black. He was brought before the Wizengamot only once, and it was not a trial, it was a sentencing. The Chief Warlock looked down at him, read the charges, and asked if he had anything to say. Sirius said nothing. He just stared ahead. The guilt was already assumed. The sentence was passed in minutes. Azkaban, life. Barty Crouch Sr. made sure of it. He was obsessed with efficiency, with swift justice. The crime demanded an immediate response, and so Sirius Black's fate was sealed. The journey to Azkaban was short, but for Sirius, it was an eternity of silence. The chains around his wrists were cold and heavy. The Ministry boat smelled of salt and damp and fear. When the fortress rose from the mist, it was not a building. It was a wound in the world, a place where happiness went to die. The Dementors felt him before they saw him. They poured from the iron gates like a tide of rot and decay. They circled the boat, drawn to the guilt that drenched him. But there was an anomaly. There was a streak of innocence in the darkness. It confused them. They tried to feed on him, but the core of him was solid. When the ministry boats reached the island, Sirius Black was pulled from the hold. The Dementors glided silently across the rocks. They did not need to touch him to know what he was feeling. They could taste his guilt, but they could not taste the specific source. Was he guilty of betraying the Potters? No, but he was guilty of pride, of being too clever, of suggesting the switch to Pettigrew in the first place. The Dementors could not distinguish between his guilt over the deaths and the actual guilt of murder. To them, all despair tasted the same. The Dementors visited him within hours of his arrival. They forced him to relive the night of October 31st over and over. He saw the green flash. He heard the screams. He saw James's body. He saw Lily's. The Dementors did not understand truth. They only understood suffering. Sirius Black had an ocean of suffering within him, and they drank deeply from it. But the ocean had a bottom, and at the bottom, untouched by the Dementors, was the truth. The cell door slammed shut behind him. It was an iron gate, but no lock was truly needed. The Dementors were the locks. The sea was the wall. The hopelessness was the sentence. He was placed in a cell high in the fortress at first, but as the years passed and his notoriety grew, the ministry moved him deeper. They put him in the darkest, most remote cell they could find. They wanted to make an example of him. They wanted everyone to know what happened to those who betrayed the light. His cell was far from any corridor the Aurors walked. The only sounds were the howling of the wind, the crashing of the sea against the stone, and the soft, chilling whisper of the Dementors as they passed by. There was no daylight in his cell. There was no night. There was only a perpetual, grey twilight filtered through the sea and the stone. The Aurors brought food twice a day, sliding it through a slot in the door. Sirius never spoke to them. He barely ate. He simply existed. He held on to the image of a rat. Peter Pettigrew, alive and well, living someone else's life while Sirius rotted in a cell. That knowledge was his anchor. It was a cold, hard, painful anchor, but it kept him from drifting into the abyss. The years passed slowly for Sirius Black. He did not age like a normal man. His hair grew long and matted. His skin turned pale. His teeth yellowed and grew long. The prison consumed his body, but it could not break his spirit. The Dementors took everything they could. They took his happy memories, forcing him to relive the betrayal over and over, but they could not take the truth. Sirius held onto the truth like a drowning man holds onto a piece of driftwood. He was not guilty. He became a shadow to the Dementors, a dog in the dark, impossible to fully corrupt. The Dementors feasted on despair, but Sirius Black was not completely despairing. He was angry. He was determined. A man with a mission is hard to break. The most hated prisoner in Britain sat in his cell, year after year, holding on to the image of a rat. It was not a comfortable hope. It was a festering, burning obsession, but it was a purpose. And in the heart of Azkaban, where purpose was the first thing to die, Sirius Black never let go. The truth was his anchor, and one day, that anchor would pull him free. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. When Sirius Black was brought to Azkaban in 1981, he was already a man torn apart by grief. The loss of James and Lily Potter was a wound that would never heal, but it was not the only weight he carried. The whole wizarding world believed he had betrayed them. The Daily Prophet called him a Death Eater. The ministry locked him away without trial. But inside the cold stone walls of that fortress, Sirius knew the truth. He knew that the betrayal had come from Peter Pettigrew, and that knowledge was the only thing he had left. The Dementors came for him, as they came for everyone. They hovered at the door of his cell and searched his mind for warmth, hoping to feed on the light of his memories. Most prisoners break almost immediately. They lose themselves in the horror of their own worst moments, until there is nothing left but an empty shell. But Sirius could not give the Dementors what they wanted. He could not summon happiness. There was no happy memory strong enough to hold against the weight of what he had lost. But he did not need happiness. He had something else. He had anger. He had certainty. He had the raw, unbroken knowledge that he was innocent. Every time the Dementors tried to drag him into despair, he held on to that truth like a lifeline. I did not betray them. Peter did. The words became a mantra repeated endlessly in the silence of his cell. It was not a pleasant thought. It was sharp and bitter, and it cut him every time he held it. But it was real, and because it was real, the Dementors could not take it from him. They could make him relive the night. Everything fell apart. They could show him James and Lily as they died. They could force him to feel the guilt for the choices that led to that moment. But they could not make him believe a lie. He knew the betrayal was not his, and that knowledge gave him a small, painful anchor against the darkness that surrounded him. This was something the Ministry had never understood. They believed the Dementors were infallible. They thought no prisoner could resist the despair that the creatures brought. But Sirius proved that the Dementors had a weakness. They fed on happiness because happiness was the easiest thing to consume, but they had no power over other kinds of strength. Anger could hold them back. Certainty could block them. A mind that refused to surrender, even when joy was gone, could still survive. Sirius survived because he clung to a single thought. He was innocent. It was not a thought that brought him comfort. It was not a thought that warmed him, but it was a thought that kept him sane. In the cold isolation of Azkaban, he repeated it over and over again until it became part of the stone around him. The Dementors could take his memories. They could take his hope, but they could not take the truth he held inside. Year after year he endured. Other prisoners faded into madness or simply stopped eating and wasted away, but Sirius remained. He held on to his anger and his certainty with a grip that refused to loosen. He could not escape. He could not prove his innocence to the world, but he could keep himself alive, and in a place built to destroy every shred of light that was a victory of its own. The prison continued its slow work around him. Walls that had held countless souls before him watched as he fought his quiet war in the dark. But where others had crumbled, Sirius Black stood firm, anchored by the one thing the Dementors could not reach. And in that way, he revealed a truth about Azkaban that even the Ministry had never fully grasped. The prison was not unbeatable. It only seemed that way until someone found a thought strong enough to hold against the dark. That strength would eventually lead Sirius to the first real chance of freedom he had seen in 12 years. When he was given a newspaper and saw the photograph of the Weasley family with their pet rat, he recognized Peter at once. The missing finger, the familiar shape, the knowledge that Peter was alive and close to Harry turned his anger into purpose. Sirius was no longer surviving only for himself. He had someone to find, someone to stop. And because he had once been an animagus, he possessed one advantage the guards had never understood. He could become a dog. In that form, his body was smaller, thinner, and easier to force through the bars of his cell. More importantly, the Dementors did not truly see him. They sensed human emotion. As a dog, Sirius felt different to them. His thoughts were simpler, his despair less recognizable, and his weakened body did not draw their attention in the same way. He slipped through the prison walls, crossed the freezing sea, and swam toward the shore. It was an escape that should have been impossible. Yet Azkaban had failed because Sirius had never become what it expected him to become. He had been broken, starved and haunted, but he had not surrendered. His innocence had kept his mind alive. His rage had kept his will intact. And when the moment finally came, that same stubborn refusal to accept the darkness gave him the strength to run. Sirius Black survived his first year in Azkaban because he knew he was innocent. That knowledge became a shield. A single thought that the Dementors could not fully consume. But survival was not the same as escape. The prison was built to break souls, not bodies, and for most it succeeded. Sirius, however, had a secret that would ultimately make him the first person to break out of Azkaban without assistance. Sirius was an unregistered animagus. He could transform into a large black dog at will. This was a skill he had mastered years ago, during his school days with James Potter. But in Azkaban, this ability became something far more significant. It became his key to freedom. In his animal form, his emotions became simpler. The complexity of human despair, regret and fear was muted. His mind took on the nature of a dog, focused on the present, on basic needs. This made him less nourishing to the Dementors. Their ability to feed on his happiness was diminished because, in that form, his emotional spectrum was narrower, less rich. They still sensed him, but he was no longer the feast they expected. His smaller body also allowed him to slip through gaps that would trap a human prisoner. The prison walls, designed to contain wizards, had crevices and cracks that a dog could navigate. Sirius, as Padfoot, could squeeze through spaces that a man could not. He could move where the Dementors did not think to look. The prison built to destroy wizards was vulnerable to a prisoner who became something else. Azkaban was designed for humans with human weaknesses, but Sirius was no longer just human. He was a creature that existed outside their expectations, the very traits that made the prison inescapable. The isolation, the guards, the fortress were useless against a dog that could slip through the bars and into the night. He waited for the right moment. When the Dementors left his cell for their regular feeding, he transformed and slipped through the thin gap in the bars. From there, he moved through the corridors, staying in the shadows, using his senses to avoid detection. The cold and the dark were no different in animal form, but his purpose was clearer. He reached the outermost wall, found a crack that led to the shore, and then, as the waves crashed against the rocks, he shifted back to his human self for just long enough to swim. But even in the water, he could become the dog again, cutting through the current with a stamina that no man could sustain. His escape would shock the wizarding world, proving that even Azkaban was not infallible. It demonstrated that the prison's security, though long believed to be absolute, relied on assumptions about its prisoners. Sirius did not break through the walls with magic or strength. He simply stopped being what the prison expected him to be. The Dementors, in their hunger, had overlooked the possibility that a prisoner might change, not just in form, but in essence, and that oversight opened the door for a freedom that should not have been possible. What gave Sirius the final reason to act was a photograph in the Daily Prophet. Cornelius Fudge had brought the newspaper with him during a visit to Azkaban, and Sirius saw the Weasley family pictured in Egypt. Sitting on Ron Weasley's shoulder was a rat named Scabbers. To everyone else, it was an ordinary pet, but Sirius recognized the missing toe, the same detail Peter Pettigrew had used to fake his own death years before. Peter was alive. He had not been murdered by Sirius. He had escaped in his animagus form and spent years hiding beside the very boy Peter had helped orphan. Sirius understood at once that Harry was in danger. Pettigrew had betrayed James and Lily to Voldemort once, and he could do it again. That knowledge gave Sirius something Azkaban had spent years trying to erase: purpose. After reaching the mainland, Sirius was weak, freezing, and hunted. The Ministry announced that he was armed and dangerous, telling the public that he had escaped to murder Harry Potter. Dementors were sent across Britain to search for him, and the wizarding world feared his name once more. Yet Sirius was not hunting Harry, he was hunting Peter. For the first time in 12 years, Sirius had a path forward. He could not undo what had happened to James and Lily. He could not reclaim the years stolen by Azkaban, but he could protect their son, expose the traitor, and prove that the man locked in the fortress had never been the real criminal, the dog in the cell. That form was his shield, but it was also his instrument. For 12 years, the Dementors glided past his door. They sought the human emotions of a broken man, a traitor, a murderer. but they found a dog. Simple animal feelings: hunger, cold, fatigue. Nothing deep enough to feed on. Nothing that screamed with the guilt of a crime he did not commit. And so they ignored him. That was his greatest deception. And it took 12 years to perfect. In 1993, Sirius Black escaped Azkaban without outside help. He crossed the sea in dog form and vanished into Britain. Every detail of that escape relies on the quiet, patient craft of a man who taught himself to think like the creature he could become. He studied the guards. He learned when the Dementors drifted away from the outer halls, distracted by the despair of a fresh arrival. He knew the exact moment of the day when the human wardens, the ones who still drew breath, came to push food through the slot. He knew their routines. He had no wand. He had no followers. He had a skeleton of a body, a starved mind, and the ability to turn into a large black dog. One night, when the lock turned and the iron door groaned open, he did not wait for the bowl of thin stew. He forced the transformation. Bones shifted, muscles rearranged, fur pushed through his skin. He was not Sirius Black, the infamous killer. He was Padfoot, the dog. He slipped between the legs of the terrified guard, out of the cell, down the stone corridor, past the Dementor that floated aimlessly at the end of the hall. The Dementor did not react. It sensed a beast, not a man. It was not programmed to hunt dogs. He found the outer wall. He found the sea. It was a barely survivable leap. The water was a dark plunge into the North Sea, a cold that seizes the lungs and drags the warmth from a body in seconds. He crossed the sea in dog form. He swam until his legs were limp weights. He swam until he could no longer feel his snout. He swam through cramps and exhaustion, and the absolute certainty that the water would take him. But he had not been a man for months. He was a creature of pure will. He reached the shore, Britain, and he vanished into Britain. The Ministry's entire world collapsed inward. The Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge, received the news and went pale. Azkaban was their greatest boast. No one had ever broken out of Azkaban. The Dementors were infallible. The prison was perfect. But now, a man convicted of the worst crimes imaginable, Sirius Black, the betrayer of James and Lily Potter, the murderer of Peter Pettigrew and 12 Muggles, was free. The Ministry responded with panic. They treated the breakout as proof that a murderer is hunting Harry Potter. Wanted posters went up across the wizarding world. Every fireplace flared with the same frantic message. Sirius Black is armed and dangerous. Sirius Black is coming for Harry. The terror was genuine, even if the premise was a complete misreading of the truth. The truth is more tragic than the Ministry could ever allow themselves to imagine. Sirius Black had not escaped to continue the dark work of Lord Voldemort. He had not broken free to finish a mission for the Death Eaters. He had escaped to protect Harry and find the real traitor. The only thing that had kept Sirius sane in that cell, the only thought that burned through the soup of misery created by the Dementors, was the absolute certainty that Peter Pettigrew was alive, and that Peter, the insignificant cowardly rat who had framed him, who had faked his own death, was currently living as a pet in the house of the Weasley family, close to Harry. The very threat Sirius was accused of being was actually being posed by the true villain. Sirius did not escape for freedom. He escaped for justice and for redemption. He crossed a freezing sea not to run away from the world, but to run directly into its centre. He arrived on the mainland, knowing he was the most hunted man in all of magical Britain. He could not use magic without being tracked by the Ministry. He could not walk the streets in his human form. He was a ghost in the living world, so he stayed in his dog form. He lived in caves, in forests, beneath the shadow of buildings. He collected scraps. He listened to conversations. He waited. The first unassisted escape from Azkaban was not a masterwork of criminal genius. It was a desperate act performed by a man who had nothing left but the shape of a dog and the single, unshakable certainty that he had a job to do. He left behind a prison in chaos, a ministry in disgrace, and a legend that would terrify the wizarding world for years. But the man who walked out of that cell was not the monster they described. He was a broken, angry, loving man who had endured the worst prison in existence and emerged with one goal. And so Sirius Black remained in the shadows. He watched from the edge of the forbidden forest. He followed whispers into the village of Hogsmeade. He was there, unseen, unheard, a dog in the dark, waiting for the moment he could finally confront the truth and clear a name that had been buried beneath 12 years of slander. The prison was behind him. The Dementors could not touch him here, but the desperation of that escape had not left him. It was etched into every step he took through the forests of Britain. A man like that, a man who had outwitted Azkaban, would not stop. He would not rest. He would find the rat. When Sirius Black crossed the North Sea in the form of a dog and vanished into the British countryside, the Ministry of Magic found itself facing a crisis it had never anticipated. For 12 years, it had held the most dangerous prisoner in the world. For 12 years, their perfect prison, a fortress of stone and despair, guarded by creatures that fed on happiness, had appeared completely inescapable. Now, that illusion was shattered in a single night. The alarm was raised. The newspapers screamed warnings. Aurors were dispatched from their warm beds to patrol the cold, dark corners of the country. The entire wizarding nation was placed on alert, and the story the Ministry had told the world for so long suddenly looked very, very fragile. The official narrative had always been so tidy, so comfortable. The Ministry had constructed a perfect sealed story. Sirius Black was Lord Voldemort's lieutenant, his right hand, the man who knew all his secrets. He was the one who betrayed James and Lily Potter to the Dark Lord on that fateful night in Godric's Hollow. He was the one who murdered Peter Pettigrew and a street full of muggles with a single blast of a wand. He was a monster, a traitor, a Death Eater, and he was exactly where he belonged, wasting away on a rock in the North Sea. But a tidy narrative is a very dangerous thing when it is never truly questioned, when it is repeated so often that it becomes confused with fact. The Ministry had accepted the surface of events because it was comfortable, because it was easy, because Azkaban existed to make problems disappear. They had convicted Sirius Black without a trial. They had thrown him into the deepest, darkest cell and declared the case closed. They had given Peter Pettigrew an Order of Merlin, first class, and declared him a hero. And they had never, not once, looked for another answer. The very existence of Azkaban encouraged this blindness. A prison with a legendary 0 breakout rate allowed the Ministry to lock people away and never think about them again. Out of sight, out of mind. The Ministry did not want rehabilitation. They did not want investigation. They wanted finality. The prison was not meant to be fair. It was meant to be final. But Peter Pettigrew was not dead. The man celebrated as a hero, the man whose mother sent Sirius Black to Azkaban with her grief and her fury, was very much alive. He had faked his own death in a spectacular explosion of deception. He had killed 12 muggles with a single curse, carved a crater in a busy muggle street, severed one of his own fingers, and left a single scrap of robe behind as a stage prop. Then he had done the one thing no one expected. He transformed, because Peter Pettigrew was an unregistered animagus. Just like Sirius Black, he became a rat. Not a dramatic wolf or a noble stag or a great black dog. He became a small, brown, very common rat. And while the Ministry was giving him a posthumous medal and erecting statues in his honour, he scurried into the sewers of London and vanished from the history books. So while Sirius Black sat in a freezing cell on a barren rock in the North Sea, losing his mind to the Dementors, the man truly responsible for the Potters' deaths was living freely. He was warm and safe. He was fed and cared for by a family that had no idea their son's pet rat was the most wanted fugitive in magical history. The injustice of it is almost impossible to fully grasp. Sirius was punished for crimes he did not commit, tortured for 12 years by creatures he could not fight. He was stripped of his name, his identity, his future. He was a broken man before he was even properly a man at all. His life stolen piece by piece by the cold and the dark and the relentless pressure of the Dementors' presence. Meanwhile, the guilty man lived openly, hiding in the most obvious of places. A beloved pet in a happy family home, Azkaban becomes a symbol here, not only of cruelty, but of catastrophic injustice. It is a machine that grinds up the innocent alongside the guilty, and the Dementors, the silent guards, do not care which is which. They only care about feeding. They only care about the taste of despair. They are utterly indifferent to truth, and the Ministry, by relying on them so completely, became just as indifferent to truth. Sirius survived that place because of one single thing. He knew he was innocent. That knowledge was a tiny ember of hope, a stubborn, flickering flame the Dementors could never fully extinguish. They could take away his happy memories, cloud them, bury them under an ocean of cold, but they could never take away his righteousness, his anger, his absolute certainty that he had been wronged. But hope and anger alone might not have been enough to keep him alive for 12 years. The Dementors feed on hope. They drain it slowly, drop by drop. He survived also because he was an animagus. In the dark of his cell, he transformed into Padfoot, a large black dog, and in that animal form, his emotions became simpler, less human, less nourishing to the creatures that guarded him. The Dementors grew weaker around him. He grew stronger, and he waited, patient as the stone walls around him, for his moment to arrive. He waited until he saw the one thing he needed to see. A headline in the Daily Prophet, an article about the Weasley family, a poor but large wizarding family, winning a grand prize galleon drawing, and in the photograph, sitting on the shoulder of the youngest Weasley boy, was a rat with a missing toe, Peter Pettigrew, alive and well, and living in the home of the very family that would be the closest thing to a godfather that Harry Potter had ever known. And on that day, Azkaban could not hold him anymore. He did not break out with curses or spells. He did not have an accomplice on the outside, no polyjuice potion, no smuggled wand. He simply changed shape, slipped through the bars of his cell as a dog, padded silently past the few Dementors who could barely sense him, and swam the freezing sea. He crossed the entire North Sea in his dog form, driven by a singular burning purpose. The man who was never there was coming back to claim the truth. The Ministry did not understand. They could not see the truth. They assumed he was hunting Harry Potter to finish the Dark Lord's work. They assumed he was a loyal Death Eater, seeking to fulfill his master's final command. They were wrong about almost everything, but they were right that he was coming, and the security they put in place would cast a shadow over Hogwarts that would change everything for the students inside. They sent Dementors, the very creatures who had failed to hold him, to guard the school. They wrapped the castle in a blanket of despair and cold. They brought the horror of Azkaban into the halls of the only safe place Harry Potter had ever known. They did this because they could not see the truth. They could not see that the threat to their society was not the escaped prisoner, but the trusted pet. They could not see that Azkaban itself, the very symbol of their justice, had created this disaster. And because you cannot fight an enemy you refuse to see, the Ministry's blind faith in its own tidy narrative left the entire wizarding world and the school of Hogwarts vulnerable to a shadow that had been hiding in plain sight for 12 long years. The truth has a way of slipping through the cracks, even in a world that works hard to bury it. Sirius Black's escape from Azkaban was not just a security breach. It was a crack in the Ministry's entire foundation. The man they had locked away without trial was free. The man they had celebrated as a hero, Peter Pettigrew, was a ghost hiding in the shadows. And the Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge, had no idea how to contain the fallout. He needed a solution. He needed a show of force. He needed to prove to the wizarding world that his government was still in control. So, he looked to the sea. He looked to the island fortress of Azkaban, where the Dementors had held their vigil for centuries. The creatures were terrifying, yes, but they were effective. No one had ever escaped from Azkaban without help, and now that Sirius Black had proved the prison was vulnerable, the Ministry made a fateful choice. They did not change the prison. they weaponized its guardians. During Harry Potter's third year, Dementors were stationed around Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Their mission was singular: to hunt down Sirius Black. They guarded every entrance. They patrolled the grounds in their rotting cloaks, gliding silently over the snow. They were the new, terrifying face of security. Their presence revealed something deeply unsettling about the Ministry's priorities. It revealed how easily they deployed the Dementors beyond prison walls. The creatures were never truly bound to Azkaban by any magical law. They were bound only by an agreement, a pact that allowed them to feed on the misery of the prisoners. When the Ministry felt threatened, that pact expanded. The line between prison guard and national weapon vanished overnight. Cornelius Fudge simply pointed the Dementors at the problem and hoped for the best. He did not consider what that meant for the children inside the castle. He did not consider that the guards of Azkaban were not instruments of justice. They were instruments of despair. For the students, the cost was immediate and devastating. They experienced the same cold, the same fear, the same emotional violation that prisoners in Azkaban endured daily. Hogwarts was no longer a sanctuary of learning and wonder. It was an occupied territory. The warmth of the castle was constantly besieged by an encroaching frost. Students felt a weight in the corridors, a sense of dread that had no specific source. Happiness felt fragile. Laughter felt guilty. Meals in the Great Hall were quieter. The enchanted ceiling reflected a sky that was perpetually grey. For Harry Potter, the experience was uniquely brutal. He could feel them before he saw them. The air would turn thick and cold. The light would drain from the world. And then he would hear her, the screaming, a woman's voice, pleading, dying. It was his mother's death, echoing through the creature's presence. The Dementors fed on Harry more easily than almost anyone else in the school. Simply because he had so much profound trauma to offer them, they did not need to touch him. They just needed to be near him. The first Quidditch match of the season proved this beyond any doubt. Hufflepuff versus Gryffindor. Harry's first match back on his broom. 100 feet in the air, the cold hit him. He looked down. The Dementors rose over the stadium wall, 100 of them, gliding into the pitch. They had not been invited to the game. They came because they sensed a feast. And Harry fell, not from his broom but from the sky inside his own mind. He heard his mother die again. He heard the flash of green light. He heard the last thing she ever said. The prison had come to the Quidditch pitch. The Ministry had sent the very creatures that drained hope to a schoolyard game, and they nearly killed a 14-year-old boy. Because of it, the supposed guards were shown to be dangerous wherever they were allowed to feed. They didn't care about innocence. They didn't care about justice. They cared about the feast of despair. This was proven in the Shrieking Shack. When the Dementors cornered Sirius Black, they did not pause to hear the truth. They did not wait for a trial. They moved to administer the Dementor's kiss. They would have destroyed his soul, right there, in the middle of the village, with children watching. They were not an instrument of justice. They were an instrument of pure consumption. The Ministry's great solution was to bring the very horror of Azkaban into the lives of students. The prison was never truly confined to the island. The prison was mobile. It wore cloaks and hoods. It floated on the wind. As Professor Lupin explained, the Dementors were among the foulest creatures to walk the earth. They infested the darkest, filthiest places. They gloried in decay and despair, and the Ministry had invited them inside. The Ministry had made them the solution. The Dementors were never the solution. They were the symptom of a Ministry that had forgotten what it was supposed to guard. They were the symptom of a world that feared the truth more than it feared the darkness. The decision to deploy the Dementors was a profound miscalculation. It demonstrated that the Ministry valued the perception of control over the actual safety of its people. They brought the despair of Azkaban to the front door of the school, forcing it into the lives of students who had no part in the war that created the prison. The walls of Hogwarts, enchanted and ancient, offered no protection against the force that lived inside the Dementors. It was a force the Ministry had happily unleashed, a storm of cold and memory that would find its way directly to Harry Potter, and in doing so, it proved that the dangers of Azkaban were never left behind on the island. They were carried wherever the Ministry allowed them to feed. The previous chapter left us with Dementors trolling the grounds of Hogwarts, a fortress that had stood for centuries without their kind haunting its perimeter. The Ministry, in its desperation to recapture Sirius Black, had extended the reach of these creatures far beyond the island of Azkaban. It was an experiment in control, and it was about to fail in a very public and terrifying way. The Ministry of Magic has always prided itself on its ability to regulate the magical world. Control is the highest virtue of the wizarding bureaucracy. The use of Dementors as prison guards was the ultimate expression of this control, or so it seemed. The Ministry believed it had transformed a chaotic, terrifying evil into a functional, predictable tool. It was a masterpiece of administrative arrogance. The Dementors were given rules, and the Ministry assumed the rules would be followed. But a Dementor cannot be ruled. It can only be fed. Hunger is the only law a Dementor understands. The fundamental flaw in the Ministry's arrangement with the Dementors was a deep misunderstanding of their nature. The Ministry believed they had made a treaty, a bargain of mutual benefit. The Dementors would stand guard, and in return the Ministry would guarantee them a steady supply of prisoners to feed upon. But Dementors do not understand contracts. They understand hunger. That hunger is not a compass that can be set to a specific target. It is a tide that rises and falls, seeking the richest shore of emotion to crash against. When the Dementors arrived at Hogwarts, they encountered a target far more tempting than any fugitive. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, carried a weight of trauma that few could match. The echo of a dying mother, the guilt of his own survival, the constant thrum of a dark connection to a returning evil. To a Dementor, he was not a student to be protected, he was a feast. The Ministry had ordered them to hunt Sirius Black, but the Dementors' own instincts overruled their orders almost immediately. The first major breach came during a Quidditch match. Harry was in the air, riding high on a gust of confidence. The crowd was a roar of noise and light. It was a moment of pure, unguarded joy. The Dementors sensed it. They did not see a Quidditch game. They saw a concentration of the very thing they craved. The Dementors did not glide onto the pitch. They rose from the stands like a stain spreading across the sky. They moved deliberately against Harry Potter, ignoring every directive the Ministry had given them. Harry fell from his broom 50 feet to the ground, his mind wiped clean, his memories drained. The sound of his mother's scream filled his ears, drowning out the crowd, drowning out everything. The Ministry's precious Dementors had attacked a child at a school sanctioned by the Ministry itself. The control was an illusion. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an accident. It was a declaration of independence. The Dementors were telling the Ministry quite clearly that they would feed where they pleased. Professor Dumbledore intervened, driving the creatures back with a corporeal Patronus, a casting so powerful it proved that these beings could be opposed. The Ministry, however, did not see it that way. They saw a breach in protocol, a security flaw that could be patched with more regulations. They utterly refused to see the deeper truth, that the Dementors had no interest in protocol. Later that same year, they cornered him again. This time far from the pitch, by the shore of the lake. This attack was different. It was not a public spectacle. It was an ambush. The Dementors had learned. They had tasted Harry Potter before, and they wanted more. They descended on him in a place of solitude, away from the eyes of the Ministry. This was a concerted hunt. This was a predator, learning the patterns of its prey. The Ministry believed the Dementors were mindless instruments of a policy, but the Dementors showed that they could think, they could plan, they could hunt. The Ministry had given them a taste of freedom, and the Dementors intended to feast on it. Harry and his godfather were defenseless against them. The cold air crystallized into a wall of despair. The Dementors were no longer even pretending to look for Sirius Black. They were hunting for the specific taste of their favorite prey. They were hunting Harry Potter. The Ministry had brought wolves to a school to catch a single man, and the wolves had decided that the students were on the menu. The difference between a guard dog and a predator is loyalty. The Dementors had none. They served the Ministry only as long as it served them. In that moment by the lake, the entire history of Azkaban was rewritten. The Dementors proved that their allegiance was a matter of convenience. They were not guardians of justice. They were scavengers who had found a comfortable perch. The Ministry had become their zookeepers, and the door of the cage had been left wide open. This escalation exposed the absolute failure of the Ministry's founding bargain. Monsters cannot be reliably governed. You cannot sign a peace treaty with a plague. You cannot handcuff misery. The Dementors were never tools of justice. They were parasites that the Ministry had chosen to house with a prison system. The Ministry thought it had purchased security. What it had actually purchased was the temporary loyalty of a hungry predator. The moment that predator smelled easier meat or tasted a richer emotion, the contract was void. The Ministry was not governing Azkaban. It was renting space in a slaughterhouse. The bargain struck in 1718 was never a bargain. It was a surrender. The Ministry of the time was too weak, too desperate, or too cold to find another solution. They looked at the Dementors and saw an answer to a logistical problem. They did not see a moral abyss. Every wizarding government since that time has maintained the same pretense. The Dementors are a kept beast, but a kept beast is still a beast. The chain is only as strong as the hand holding it, and the Ministry's hand was trembling. Long before the Dementors arrived at Hogwarts, the attack on Harry Potter was not an anomaly, it was a confirmation. The Dementors were never fully contained. They were simply waiting. Cornelius Fudge's response to the attacks on Harry Potter is deeply telling. He did not withdraw the Dementors. He did not question their use. He simply sent more restrictive orders. He tried to treat a supernatural predator the same way he would treat a rogue wizard. Fudge represents the Ministry's institutional blindness. He could not admit that Azkaban was built on a lie, because if he did, the entire foundation of his authority would crumble alongside it. The Dementors were a pillar of the state. If the pillar was rotten, the state was rotten, and that was a truth too dangerous to face. Think about what this means for the entire institution of Azkaban. For centuries, the wizarding world believed their most dangerous prisoners were secure because of the Dementors. But if the Dementors could ignore their orders here, if they could be drawn away from their posts purely by appetite, what did that say about the security of the prison itself? Azkaban's entire reputation rested on the efficiency of creatures that had no loyalty to justice, no respect for law, no concept of duty. It was a house of cards built on the shifting sand of a monster's whim. The prison was never truly inescapable. It was simply a place where no one wanted to stay alive long enough to try. The Ministry had invited the Dementors into the heart of wizarding law enforcement. They had built the entire prison system around the assumption that the Dementors were passive tools, content to merely feed on what they were given. But Dementors are never content. Hunger is a constant state for them. The arrangement was always going to fail. It was only a question of when. The attacks on Harry Potter were the first tremor. The full earthquake was yet to come. The Dementors have demonstrated that they are a weapon that can be aimed, but never controlled once fired. The implications of this failure stretch far beyond the lake and the Quidditch pitch. The very foundation of Azkaban is now laid bare. The prison was built on a bargain with monsters, and the Ministry has just discovered the consequences of striking a deal with an adversary that has no concept of honor. The ground is shifting under the feet of the Ministry. The prison system they have relied on for centuries is no longer a stable foundation. The Dementors have shown their true nature. They are not allies. They are not tools. They are a force of nature that the ministry invited into its home, and the eviction notice was written in the frozen air above a Quidditch pitch. The cost of that invitation is not yet fully paid. The Dementors' attack on Harry Potter near the Quidditch pitch was not an isolated failure of control. It was the first visible crack in the ministry's authority over Azkaban. For centuries, the ministry had maintained the convenient fiction that the Dementors were simply Tools' mindless guards who could be directed by the state. But the Dementors had never been mindless. They were ancient, intelligent spirits of decay, aware of the world and their place in it, and they understood power with a clarity that human wizards often lacked. When Cornelius Fudge refused to believe Lord Voldemort had returned, the Dementors did not make the same mistake. They felt him. They heard the whisper of his magic on the wind, the echo of his resurrection in the very atmosphere, and they chose their side, not with words, but with instinct. The island fortress of Azkaban had always relied on two things: its impossible isolation and the unbreakable loyalty of its guards. By the summer after Voldemort's resurrection, one of those pillars had crumbled entirely. The Dementors were no longer watching the prisoners for the ministry. They were simply waiting for orders from a master they respected. The Mass Breakout itself remains a story told in whispers. It happened with chilling efficiency. There were no alarms. No epic battles echoed through the stone corridors. The Death Eaters simply rose. The cells that had held Bellatrix Lestrange for 14 years were found empty. The iron doors stood open, their locks intact. The Dementors had either bowed to the escaping prisoners or simply stepped aside. It is the only explanation for how so many of Voldemort's most dangerous followers escaped without a single guard raising a wand in defense. The ministry had built its entire security policy on the claim that Azkaban was unbreakable. Escape was impossible, but the breakout shattered that claim completely. The prison, which had held terror within its walls for centuries, suddenly emptied its most dangerous contents into the world. Bellatrix Lestrange, Rodolphus and Rabastan Lestrange, Antonin Dolohov, Augustus Rookwood. They did not just gain their freedom, they gained a powerful piece of propaganda for the Dark Lord. If he could break his most loyal followers out of the most secure prison in Britain, then no one was safe, and everything the ministry had built was a lie. The fear that Azkaban had imposed on the wizarding population was turned back upon them. The prison that was meant to be the ultimate deterrent, a place so terrible that the very thought of it prevented crime, had now become a source of that very fear released directly into the world. Every dark wizard now knew that even the depths of Azkaban could not hold them if their master was strong enough. The fortress became a symbol not of justice, but of the ministry's complete and total impotence. This was the moment Azkaban truly broke. Not the walls, not the spells, but the idea behind it. It had been built by a madman, maintained by cowards, and guarded by monsters. The Dementors were not jailers in any traditional sense. They were a force of nature that the ministry had clumsily tried to domesticate, and when the weather of the magical world turned, they turned with it. Voldemort offered the Dementors what the ministry never could: a reign of terror without boundaries. The escape was the proof of that alliance. Let us be specific about what was lost that night. The cells of the highest security wing held prisoners considered the most dangerous in a century. Bellatrix Lestrange, who had tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom into permanent insanity. Antonin Dolohov, a sadistic killer who had murdered Gideon and Fabian Pruett. Augustus Rookwood, a spy embedded deep within the Department of Mysteries. These were not petty criminals or misguided followers. They were the vanguard of the Dark Lord's army, and they were set loose upon a world that had convinced itself the war was over. The ministry tried to stem the tide of panic. Cornelius Fudge insisted that the breakout was an isolated incident, that the Dementors were still loyal to the ministry. But every witch and wizard in Britain could now see the truth. The prison that relied on fear could not contain those who transcended fear. The emptiness of Azkaban's reputation had always been a myth. Now the myth was dead. and the world had to face what the reality actually was. The Mass Breakout forced a choice upon the Ministry. They could try to rebuild Azkaban, reassert control over the Dementors through force or new treaties, or they could face the truth that the entire prison system was fundamentally broken. For the rest of the war, the Dementors continued to serve, but they served themselves and the Dark Lord. They became an occupying fortizan, not guards. Prisoners died faster. Hope drained out of the cells entirely. The island became a place of pure stagnation, and suffering a holding pen for the Dark Lord's enemies. The eventual solution, when it finally came after the Battle of Hogwarts, was not to fix Azkaban, but to change its nature entirely. The Ministry under Kingsley Shacklebolt expelled the Dementors. The fortress was stripped of its ancient horror. The guards were replaced by trained Aurors, rotated regularly from the mainland to preserve their sanity. But that system required a complete rejection of the old bargain. The Mass Breakout was the first real step toward that understanding. It was a painful, terrifying lesson in the consequences of surrendering justice to creatures that feed on suffering. The empty cells of Azkaban's highest security wing told a story that could not be ignored, a story that ended with the fall of the Old Order. The mass escape of Bellatrix Lestrange and her fellow Death Eaters was not a conclusion to the story of Azkaban. It was a herald of a much deeper corrosion. The fortress had failed to contain the servants of the Dark Lord, and that failure exposed the rot spreading through the very walls of the Ministry itself. The prison was a symptom of a system that was already crumbling from within. When the followers of Voldemort finally seized control of the Ministry, Azkaban changed hands, but the fortress did not change its nature. It had always been a place where hope was systematically destroyed, a maw of despair built by a madman in the 15th century and hidden from the Muggle world by powerful concealment charms. When the Ministry first discovered the island after Ekrizdis died, they were horrified by what they found. The Dementors were already there. They were the true inhabitants. The Ministry did not build Azkaban into a prison. They negotiated a lease with its original owners. The Dementors would remain. They would guard the prisoners, and in return, they would be allowed to feed. It was a bargain that traded justice for security, and it defined the fortress from that moment forward, a place where the punishment was not a fixed term of years, but an endless consumption of the soul. When the Death Eaters took power, they did not disrupt this ancient arrangement. They refined it. They weaponized it. The first act of the new regime was to open the deep cells. The imprisoned Death Eaters were brought out into the cold grey light of the administrative chambers. Yet they were not simply freed. The Ministry, now under the control of the Dark Lord's followers, staged sham trials. Their records were expunged. They were declared falsely convicted by the previous, corrupt administration. They were rewarded for their loyalty, and their time served in a prison that was now their own. Bellatrix Lestrange, Rodolphus Lestrange, and the others did not walk free as escaped convicts. They walked free as vindicated martyrs of a new order, their crimes officially erased from history. They had endured the cruelty of the old regime, and they returned to the world not in shame, but in triumph. The cells they vacated were filled before the stone could grow cold. The Muggleborn Registration Commission was established. Across Britain, witches and wizards born to non-magical parents were torn from their homes in coordinated raids. They were brought to the Ministry, brought before a tribunal, and accused of the crime of stealing magic from the true wizarding community. The trials were overseen by Dolores Umbridge, a woman who had always found her greatest pleasure in the exercise of power over the helpless. There was no justice in those hearings. There was no real defense. The verdict was always guilty. The sentence was always Azkaban, and so the prisoners were sent into the fortress in chains. The machinery of despair, ancient and cold, was turned openly against the innocent. The Dementors had always fed on the misery of the prisoners, but now they were given a feast of the wrongly condemned. The despair of an innocent person is the most potent food for a Dementor. It has no justification. It is pure undiluted terror and confusion. The creatures grew stronger. The cold in the prison deepened. The stone of the walls was black and damp, soaked in centuries of suffering. It held a chill that was deeper than any winter. The cells were not designed for human comfort. They were holes cut into the rock, chambers, where the only light came from thin slits that let in the grey North Sea sky. The sound of the sea was always there, a constant, rhythmic crash against the base of the island. It was a sound that slowly drove prisoners to madness, not because it was loud, but because it was endless. The Dementors did not need to speak. They did not need to threaten. They simply passed by the cell doors, and the warmth drained from the air. Every happy thought evaporated. Every memory of love, of joy, of sunlight faded away, leaving only the worst moments of a life. For an innocent person, those worst moments were the memory of being torn from their family, the memory of the trial, the look of fear on a loved one's face. The Dementors fed on these memories, and they grew strong. For the first time in its long, grim history, Azkaban was not just a prison for criminals. It was a tool of political oppression, a weapon of ethnic cleansing. The innocent suffered without cause, their families left outside, wondering what had become of them. The fortress had always been a dark secret of the wizarding world, a place everyone chose to ignore for the sake of convenience. Now it was the very symbol of the regime, a fortress built not on justice, but on the suffering of the innocent. The island itself was remote, uncharted. No Muggle ship could find it. No rescue could reach it. The prisoners were utterly alone. The regime knew this. They chose Azkaban precisely because it was a place where hope went to die. But a system built on such a foundation carries the seed of its own destruction. The Dementors do not understand loyalty. They do not understand the politics of the wizarding world. They understand only hunger. The more they are fed, the more they crave. A regime that uses them as a tool of control eventually finds itself at their mercy. The Dementors do not care who is guilty and who is innocent. They care only about the taste of the despair. The poison was in the system from the moment it was established, and now it was working its way through the heart of power. Azkaban had never truly belonged to the Ministry. It belonged to the Dementors, and the Dementors were patient. The war ended with Voldemort's defeat. Azkaban, which had changed hands without changing its nature under the Death Eaters, was finally freed from their control. The innocent were released. The Death Eaters who had run the prison were swept away, and the task of rebuilding the wizarding world fell to those who had fought against the darkness. Kingsley Shacklebolt was appointed Minister for Magic. He was a man shaped by the war. He had served as an Auror. He had been a member of the Order of the Phoenix. He had seen the Ministry fail at its most basic duty, the protection of the innocent, and he understood that Azkaban could not simply be patched up and returned to its old ways. It had to be remade. The Dementors had shown their true allegiance during the war. They had bowed to Voldemort. They had fed on the innocent. The old arrangement, which had treated them as convenient, cost-effective guards, was a moral failure that had lasted for over 3 centuries. More. Shacklebolt removed them. He expelled the Dementors from Azkaban entirely. This was not a minor policy adjustment. It was the end of a deal that had stood since Damocles' Rowle first decided to use the Dementors in the early 18th century. They were no longer servants of the Ministry. They were no longer the guardians of justice. They were cast out, driven from the island they had haunted for so long. In their place came the Aurors. These were trained witches and wizards, experienced in high-level defensive magic and combat. But the Ministry was cautious. It understood that Azkaban was a place that could break a person, even without the Dementors. The island itself held a kind of darkness. It had absorbed centuries of despair. The very stones were cold in a way that felt deliberate, so the Aurors were not left on the island indefinitely. They were rotated regularly. They served their duty in short shifts, and then returned to the mainland. This was a deliberate design to keep their minds clear, to prevent the island from taking root in their thoughts. to ensure that the prison did not slowly drain them the way it had drained so many prisoners before. Under this new system, conditions in Azkaban improved significantly. Prisoners were no longer subjected to the Dementors' influence. They were not left to rot in the dark, slowly losing their memories and their will to live. They were fed properly. They were housed in cells that, while still cold, were no longer instruments of psychological torture. The prison became what it should have always been, a place of secure detention, and the results were undeniable. There have been no further breakouts from Azkaban under the new system. The fortress, which had once seen the mass escape of Bellatrix Lestrange and her fellow Death Eaters, now held secure. The reforms worked. Yet Azkaban remains on its haunted island, carrying the memory of every life hope was allowed to destroy. The reforms are real. The policies have changed, but the walls are still stone. The cells are still cold. The wind still howls through the gaps in the masonry. The centuries of suffering cannot be scrubbed away. They are part of the island itself. You can remove the Dementors, but you cannot remove what they did. The silence in Azkaban today is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of thousands of voices that were extinguished. It is the space left behind by every happy memory that was devoured. The island holds that emptiness. The prisoners who died there, the ones who forgot their own names, the ones who sat in the dark until they simply stopped eating and stopped living, they are not forgotten. The fortress remembers them. The sea crashes against the rocks below. The walls stand firm against the weather. The prison is still a prison, but it is no longer the open grave it once was. It is a place of stone and iron and cold. The ancient magic of the island, the same magic Ekrizdis first tapped into so long ago, it does not heal, it simply endures. And that is the final truth of Azkaban. The structure itself does not bend, it does not change. It was built by a madman, expanded by a fearful ministry, and guarded by monsters. The foundations of the fortress are soaked in suffering, and even under the reformed ministry, even with the aurors rotating through, even with the improved conditions, the island cannot escape its own history. The North Sea is still there, the wind is still there, the cold is still there. The aurors leave at the end of their shift. They return to their homes. They sleep in warm beds, but the island stays. The fortress stays. It sits in the middle of the sea, untouched by the reforms in any deep sense. It waits, and in its waiting, it holds everything it has ever seen. Every life taken by the Dementors, every scream absorbed by the stone, every moment of despair that echoed through its corridors. Azkaban is a prison, but it is also a record, a permanent, unchangeable record of the worst the wizarding world allowed itself to become. That is the story of Azkaban, a fortress built in madness, a prison run on cruelty, a symbol of justice that was really a monument to suffering, and finally, a place reformed but never truly forgiven. The stones will never forget, the cold will never lift, the island will always be haunted, not by spirits, but by the weight of its own history. That is where we leave Azkaban, standing in the sea, cold, silent, the wind against the stone.